Alright, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Alright, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
That of Destiny 1. Something about how the pieces all joined together in the first game and how overall the theming was way more science fiction rather than a mixture of fiction and fantasy like we have now, just made me more of a fan of the armor in the first game, especially the sets we got during Rise of Iron, like from Wrath of the Machine and Trials. And let's not forget the character poses too. On your screen right now, I'll be showcasing a couple class-by-class comparisons for both games, and it's hard for me to say that I prefer the Destiny 2 looks. Overall, this isn't a massive deal though, since there are also some seriously cool armor sets in Destiny 2, but I do believe Destiny 1 did it better. Finally, certain activities in Destiny 1 also took place on locations that we couldn't physically patrol. Areas like Mercury and the EZ were only found through Crucible maps, and overall made the universe feel larger as a result. We also can't forget the infamous Nightfall glow, which you earn from completing the weekly Nightfall, allowing you to show off a little in the tower, and how exotics were super rare, coveted items that only a few people had. But to be honest with you, I think random drop exotics are long past their novelty. Me personally, I'm totally fine with them being gone, but I do sympathize with the point of view that exotics these days are mostly used for marketing and selling new pieces of content. If you look at Renegades, for example, Service of Luzaku is from the Season Pass, the Practic Blade is from the campaign, and Heirloom is the only one that's a semi-random drop. Bungie could perhaps make more exotics per expansion like they used to, placing half as random drops and the other half as quests/marketing like they are now, but I don't know how realistic that is. Though I do admit there is something I miss about seeing an exotic drop and actually being excited about what it might be. Lastly, this is something I've seen a lot of people comment on over the years, and that is the superior art direction and overall vibe that Destiny 1 has compared to Destiny 2. And while I do think that a lot of that does come down to rose-tinted glasses, to be honest, there is certainly something to be said about how Destiny 1 just feels different to Destiny 2. It's far more gritty, gruesome, more immersive at times. Think back to when you'd see fire teams opening the Vault of Glass in patrol, join random guardians battling the Court of Oryx or Archon's Forge, again in patrol. It was more mysterious, more unknown, but in a good way, and I think it just comes down to the fact that Destiny 1 was a game made in a very different time for gaming in general. There was so much less information out there, players were discovering things on their own, the universe was fresh and exciting, and overall these things just combined into a gaming experience that was truly something special and ultimately led us all to becoming devoted fans of the franchise. This isn't to say that Destiny 2 is lacking in the art direction department though, no. Some of my favorite locations like Europa, Savathun's Throne World, and the Pale Heart are all excellent examples of a clear and brilliant artistic vision. Destiny 1 was just different, you know, in a sort of you kinda had to be there type of way. So I'll reiterate what I said at the beginning of the video. Objectively, Destiny 2 is a better game than Destiny 1. However, there are certain systems and novelties that Destiny 1 possesses that the sequel has yet to recreate. And
Oh my god, I fucked it. I fucked it. No.
past. So I really hope that in 2026, Destiny can become something reminiscent of, or at least learn from the times that came before. But with that, we have come to the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you resonated with my points. This video took a good bit to put together, so if you enjoyed, then please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and be sure to comment down below what you think Destiny 1 did better when compared to Destiny 2. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now, dear viewer.
Great video. Great video. Yeah, so about the art style, a lot of the effects inside, so like people bring it up. I even brought it up to the Destiny. Had a conversation with someone at Bungie about
Unassigned, what does that mean?
And they essentially said it's because the effects were baked in. So whereas like now you have like your static environment and then those effects are rendered. Back then, they would have to bake in the effects of that environment. You see where I'm coming from? So the assets themselves, like if it was like a gritty environment or something like that, or certain shading and things like that, that would be baked into the asset. And so that's why it aids in that immersive feel. Like in a technical sense, Destiny 2 is by far like
And no one back.
Many years ago, in the German countryside, a family had been haunted by an unknown presence. For weeks, members of the family complained about strange noises coming from the attic and footsteps leading from the edge of the woods to the corner of their property. And then one day, the family vanished. After a week of them missing from school and church, members of the community went to investigate. It was there that they found the family massacred in their own home. Quite hauntingly, it seems that whoever the killer was lived among the bodies for several days to follow, and to this day remains one of the most terrifying unsolved cases in criminal history. Hello everybody. Today we are going to be talking about the unsolved Hinterkaifeck massacre. Now, if you're familiar with true crime or unsolved murder cases, then this probably isn't anything new. The Hinterkaifeck massacre is one of the most famous unsolved murders that I've ever heard of. However, what I want to throw my hat in the ring on isn't only some new information I came across that I haven't heard mentioned on YouTube that often. However, what I want to throw my hat in the ring on isn't only some new information I came across that I haven't heard mentioned on YouTube that often. However, what I want to throw my hat in the ring on isn't only some new information I came across that I haven't heard mentioned on YouTube that often. However, what I want to throw my hat in the ring on isn't only some new information I came across that I haven't heard mentioned on YouTube that often. However, what I want to throw my hat in the ring on isn't only some new information I came across that I haven't heard mentioned on YouTube that often. However, what I want to throw my hat in the ring on isn't only some new information I came across that I haven't heard mentioned on YouTube that often. However, what I want to throw my hat in the ring on isn't only some new information I came across that I
Okay,
haven't heard
let's
mentioned on YouTube that often.
see if this works. Okay, oh my god, it's not. Okay, oh my god, it's not. Okay, oh my god, it's not. Okay, oh my god, boom.
Continue to do into 2025. And a part of that health plan is today's sponsor, AG1. AG1 is your daily morning health drink that contains things like a multivitamin, a phytonutrient blend, and probiotics all in one scoop. Based on the lengths of YouTube videos you people watch, I would imagine that fast food or delivery is a part of your daily diet. And I'm not one to throw stones, it's a part of mine too. And while that can be fun, it's not exactly good for you. But that's where AG1 is here to help. With 8 to 12 ounces of water and just a spoonful of AG1, you can start getting in on all the things your body is missing out on. One of the biggest things I noticed about AG1 is the energy I have throughout the day. Whereas I used to get tired after lunch or rely on caffeine to get me through my day, I'm now wide awake for as many hours as I'm awake. Because it's amazing how much better your body does when it gets the things that it needs. And to be clear, I'm not saying that I drank AG1 and then I lost a bunch of weight and started being more productive, but I am saying that AG1 certainly helped give me the natural energy to get things like that done. AG1 tastes great and is a part of my morning routine that I don't dread, like taking a bunch of different pills and vitamins every day. From your energy to your gut health to your immune support, AG1 is an easy way to make 2025 a little bit better than 2024. And if you're interested on starting your year on the right foot, then there's never been a better time to get in on this offer.
Hello.
That's because now, if you head to the link in the description at drinkag1.com/Wendigoon or scan the QR code, you'll be able to get $20 off your first subscription to AG1. That is right, $20 off. On top of that, you get things like a free welcome kit with a shaker bottle of vitamin D3 and K2, and some travel packs of AG1. So once again, scan the QR code or head to drinkag1.com/Wendigoon to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad. Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring the channel. As always, it means the most. Hope you all check them out. Link is in the description. We are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. The Hinterkaifeck property was called that because it was behind the small community of Kaifeck in Germany. The small farm here was made up of members of the Gruber family. And to make this story make sense, let's go ahead and break down the actual family members, as there are some repeating names and it can get confusing. And to do that, we're going to do it in the only way I know how. The owner of the Hinterkaifeck farm was a woman named Cecilia, whose family came to own the farm in the 1860s. However, shortly thereafter, her husband died. After this, she was approached by a former servant named Andreas Gruber, who married her, and the two of them had a daughter named Victoria. Also, I see the spellings for these names go back and forth. Sometimes it's Victoria with a K, sometimes it's Victoria with a C, sometimes it's Cecilia, other times it's Cecilia with a Z. I think it just depends on what language is translating the story, but you'll see it go back and forth. Victoria was born in the 1880s and grew up on the property with her family. At some point, ownership of the farm was transferred over to her. Not long before World War I, Victoria met a man named Carl Gabriel. The two of them became married and had a daughter named Cecilia that Victoria named after her mother. However, in the first year of fighting, Carl would die in World War I, leaving Victoria a widow. It was not long after this, in 1920, that Victoria would give birth to another child, a son named Joseph. Now, Victoria was not married, and the question of who the father of Joseph was is going to become a very important element of this story, especially when we theorize about who the suspect might be. Two people who also lived at the Hinterkaifeck farm but weren't related to the family were the two maids, Crescens Reiger and Maria Baumgartner. Crescens lived with the family for about a year before the massacre happened, but was not on the property during the night of the murder. Because of this, during the investigation, Crescens was interviewed a lot. On the contrary, Maria Baumgartner was there on the night of the murder, and as a matter of fact, tragically, it was her first day on the job. I should also mention that when our story takes place at the end of March 1922, Cecilia was 7 years old and Joseph was 2. Leading up to the family's untimely demise, a lot of weird stuff was happening around the farm in the early months of 1922. According to the things that the Gruber family would say to neighbors, it seemed that someone had been stalking them. The family reported seeing people standing on the edge of the tree line, just watching them before fading off into the woods. Now, it is true that on either side of the farm there were footpaths that people would frequent to and from different towns, but even because that gives excuse as to why someone would be over there, it doesn't give excuse to why they would just stand there and look at you for a while before moving away as soon as you see them. On top of that, Andreas Gruber said that he had lost a key to the front door of the house, which he couldn't find. This key will come in later. According to a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who will become a major player in the story moving forward, on March the 30th, Andreas came to him and said that he found a set of footprints that tracked from the snow at the woods on the edge of the property to the motor shed that connected to the Gruber barn. Not only that, but he found the door to the motor shed thrown open. The Gruber family, like a lot of other families that farmed in the 1920s, had a motor that was connected to the barn in order to mechanize a lot of the things within the barn. However, this actual room that housed the motor did not have a connection to the barn itself other than the small holes that the motor itself was ran through. In other words, whoever was able to throw open the door to the motor shed was not able to get access to the rest of the barn. So Gruber and Lorenz supposed that whoever did try to break into the barn wasn't able to, as there was no access from the motor shed. However, the more troubling detail is that Andreas said the set of footprints led to the barn, but he couldn't find any going away from the barn. Andreas conducted a sweep of the barn and the house and wasn't able to find anyone, but the detail remained odd. Furthermore, on the evening of March the 30th, Victoria and her father Andreas went out to town to buy supplies. While at a store, Victoria remarked that in the nights prior, the family had heard something moving around in the attic. Andreas investigated with a lantern and a shotgun, but didn't find anything. Regardless, this detail seems to have had Victoria spooked, as she is now relaying it to someone she met out in town. It was also during this trip to town that Andreas told locals stories of things like the missing key, as well as a story that he found a newspaper from Munich in the woods near his house. But after he asked the mailman if anyone nearby subscribed to it, the mailman said they didn't, and he didn't deliver that paper. So it's very plain that Andreas was suspicious, but for reasons we'll talk about later, he never took this to the police. Now, it was not new information that the Hinterkaifeck property was weird. As a matter of fact, their maid, Crescens Reiger, knew this all too well. During Crescens' entire time working with the family, she was freaked out. Crescens lived at the property for only a year and was subjected to all kinds of mental torment. She said she would often hear something stamping around in the attic, or would wake up in the middle of the night to see something jiggling her doorknob. Just a few months prior to March, Crescens had given birth to a young child and decided that she no longer wanted to stay at a farm she believed to be haunted or something similar. So Crescens and her young daughter left in early 1922. So the family began looking for a new maid, and eventually a woman named Maria Baumgartner was hired. One day after Victoria and Andreas' trip to town, on March the 31st, Maria was dropped off by her sister at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Maria's sister said hello to the family and goodbye to Maria and left late that evening and was the last one to see any member of the family alive. That night, something would happen that would become the
Armoring
subject of
or
mystery
clothing
for over a
compatible
century
with
to come. The first sign that
insert
something might be
slots will
wrong
roll
came
an
the next day
additional
on April the 1st,
slot
when Victoria's daughter
when
Cecilia
crafted
was not
using this
present at school.
upgrade. Wow.
However, Cecilia was described as a child that got sick a lot, and when she was sick, she would stay home from school, so no one thought anything of it. That same day, 2 men who delivered coffee to farms around town stopped by the household. It was normal for the Gruber family to receive their deliveries on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and given that it was a Friday, the coffee salesman arrived at the Gruber household in order to take their order and drop off their coffee. However, according to the 2 men, they made their way to the property, knocked on the door, didn't get an answer, peered in the windows and didn't see anything, and then left. Later that night, a witness who was walking to Groburn, a small town only 500 meters away from the Hinterkaifeck farm, said that he saw smoke coming from the chimney outside. The witness said that he smelled what he would describe as dirty rags, and as he was peering towards the farm, a man holding a lantern walked up to him, the light being so bright in the middle of the darkness that it blinded the witness, who put his head down and continued on his path. Over the following weekend, no one at church saw the family either, which was especially suspicious considering that Victoria was known to be faithful to her local church. However, it would be on April the 4th that the horrors of what had happened at the property would be revealed. Once again, little Cecilia did not arrive at school, but the more suspicious finding was what happened with Albert Hoffner. Albert Hoffner was a repairman from a town nearby who had come to the Hinterkaifeck farm to repair the aforementioned engine that was inside the engine room. Albert gets to the property around 9 a.m. and after knocking on the doors and hanging around the windows, doesn't see anyone. Other than the dog that is tied up near the front door, it seems that the property is completely dead. But given that the dog is tied up near the front door, Albert thinks that maybe the family is out for the day and tied the dog up as a form of security until they got back. So Albert gives it an hour, hangs out near the property waiting for someone to show up, and when they eventually don't, Albert decides to get to work by prying the lock off of the engine shed door. He fixes the engine for the next several hours and leaves the property around 2:30. Since he wasn't able to inform any member of the family that he had fixed the shed, he goes to the neighboring property and sees 2 girls who are outside taking care of the garden. These girls are Mary and Victoria Schlittenbauer, the daughters of the aforementioned Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Albert tells Mary and Victoria that he just got done fixing the motor, if one of them could inform the family whenever the family gets back. So Mary and Victoria go to their father Lorenz and tell him what Albert told them. Lorenz sends 2 of his sons over to the property next door to let the family know, but after a little bit, the sons come back and say that they couldn't find anyone either. It seems at this point that Lorenz got suspicious because, again, the family wasn't seen at church, and it's uncharacteristic for these people who work on their own farm to be gone for 4 days on end. Not to mention that when Lorenz's sons got back, they said that all of the animals were very rowdy and upset. So Lorenz gets 2 other neighbors, Jacob Sigel and Michael Pohl, to come with him to search the farm. The 3 men make it to the property and walk to the open feeding area that can be accessed from the front courtyard.
Dude, I need a
From there, the
backpack.
3 men decide to make it into the barn that connects to the house that is being barred by a wooden block on the other side. The 3 men use force to break through the door and begin to search inside of the barn itself. While walking around in the barn, one of the men feels something at their foot before they look down to see a human hand. The men quickly sweep away the hay to reveal the body of Victoria Gabriel. At that moment, they see another body behind Victoria and begin to pull it out to realize that it is the body of Andreas Gruber. It becomes apparent quickly to the men that the body of 4 family members is located through the barn, meaning Andreas, Victoria, both Cecilia the grandmother and Cecilia the granddaughter, all lying dead under the hay. Immediately, Jacob and Michael make their way back to the courtyard as Lorenz sprints into the house. Lorenz would later say that he did this in order to check on the 2-year-old Joseph. However, when Lorenz made it into the house, he saw that Joseph had also been murdered inside of his stroller. Lorenz unlocked the front door to the house and the 2 other men stepped inside. They investigated through the rest of the house to see if anyone was still there and found the body of Maria Baumgartner dead on the floor of her room. But given that Maria had just got there on March the 31st, the night that the murders happened, none of the men knew who she was. The men came outside where Lorenz's 2 aforementioned sons were waiting. Lorenz told the 2 boys to run to the nearby town and tell the mayor and police while they stayed at the crime scene. Along the way, these young boys, as you can imagine, told everyone that they passed what had happened at the farm. So word spread around fast, and very quickly, the Hinterkaifeck farm became a circus. By the time the police got there, which was only a few hours later, there were all kinds of people walking through the different rooms of the house, inspecting the dead bodies, giving their opinion, and of course, destroying evidence. Not on purpose, of course. People just, stomping around a crime scene doesn't really help a crime scene. After the police get there, they order everyone to leave except Lorenz, who gives an account of how they found everyone. And from there, they are able to piece together what might have happened on the night of March the 31st. And to show you that, I'm going to show you with the same stupid little whiteboard that I did earlier. So this is a basic layout of the house to give you an idea of what it looked like during the murder and investigation. Outside of the house was a large courtyard, and the house itself was split into 3 different structures. Over here you had the main house or living quarters where things like the bedrooms and kitchen were. This entire section was the barn, with a lot of the animal stalls being in this area and a lot of the hay and area for feeding or taking care of the animals being over here. And then this area is described in a lot of the reports as a machinery or work area, which to me sounds like the 1920s equivalent of a garage, where you work on tractors or whatever. So I'm calling it a garage. Also connected to the side of the barn, but with no way to get into the barn itself, was the motor room that I mentioned earlier, where the repairman came and did his work, and where the footprints leading to it as well as the broken door were found by Andreas earlier. When Lorenz, Michael, and Jacob arrived, the 3 of them saw that the doorway that led to the garage area of the building was wide open. After the men stepped in here, they elected to push open this door that was held shut and make their way into the barn itself. It was while in here that they would find the bodies of Victoria, Andreas, grandmother Cecilia, and granddaughter Cecilia dead, hidden under the hay. From here, as mentioned earlier, Lorenz made his way through the main section of the house, again according to him, in order to check on young Joseph. As he did this, the 2 others made their way back out to the courtyard to get to the front door. It was here that Lorenz found the body of 2-year-old Joseph, murdered in his stroller or bassinet in Victoria's room. And then, after the other 2 came in, they discovered the body of Baumgartner in her new quarters, the maid's quarters at the back of the house. From here, the 3 men came outside. Lorenz sent his sons to go tell the local police, and from here, everyone started to come to the house to see the murder scene. A couple other things to mention. This is Victoria's room, as I said, and this is Andreas and grandmother Cecilia's room over here. And then this room seems to be the dining room where a lot of the interviews took place. Another thing to mention, because this is going to come up a lot in the investigation, there was an attic that ran through some parts of the house and at least led to a sort of hayloft over the entirety of the garage and barn area. It seems that the way to get up there was at this staircase right as you are leaving the house segment of the property and working your way into the barn part of the property. So it seemed that the only way to access the attic was through this staircase in the main house. That, and there is a ladder mentioned somewhere in the police reports, either being on like the outside of the building or in the garage area. But either way, it seems that the most common way to get to the second floor or hidden area of the house is through the staircase. That will matter as we get into the details of the investigation. Also, crucially, whenever Lorenz ran through the house and then opened this front door, he had to unlock it in order to open it. That, in combination with this door being barred shut and there being no other means of access out of the house unless you broke a window, that means whoever was in the house effectively locked themselves in unless they make their way down from the attic, which we'll talk about that more, and how there was potentially a rope used for a descent either here or over here. Again, the police notes on this weren't great, given that it was 1922 and none of the departments were really talking to each other. Now, one of the reasons that the Hinterkaifeck murder sticks out so much in my mind, and one of the reasons that I find it so terrifying, is because, according to investigators, of the way that these murders played out. There were spots of blood underneath the hay and, of course, where the bodies had been left in the barn. But according to investigators, there were no other spots of blood in the rest of the house, save for the area where Maria was killed and young Joseph was killed. And all people who were murdered, except for the grandmother Cecilia, were wearing their nightgowns and sleeping clothes, or basically their pajamas. Maybe grandmother Cecilia did it because she was staying up late to get work done around the house, but it seemed that everyone else was ready to go to bed when the murders took place. What that means likely happened, and again, given that there was no blood through the rest of the house or down this hallway, is that whoever murdered these people waited in the barn and one by one had them step into the barn where they were murdered, dragged out of the doorway, and the killer awaited his next victim. I often find myself thinking, what, if anything, the killer had to do to lead the family members out one by one? Maybe one of them simply walked into the barn in order to do their nightly chores with the animals before they were killed, and then the following family members came to look. Maybe young Cecilia came to look for her mother. And how terrifying that is to imagine that while alone in your house, ready to go to bed, there's someone waiting in another part of it, ready to kill you. This theory of waiting to kill the family members also makes sense given the other two murders, because it's not like Joseph could make his way to the barn to see what the rest of his family was doing at only 2 years old. And if the killer had been watching the family for a while, well, they didn't have a maid for 2 months, and Maria had gotten there early that day, which probably meant the killer thought that he or they had killed everyone in the house after they killed these four, only to make their way into the house and see that there is a new maid that they decided to murder as well. And as mentioned, after these killings were complete, it seems that the killer stuck around with the bodies for a day or so. How monstrous to turn a house full of life into one full of just your own. The story went on to become infamous, especially in Germany, and worked its way into a lot of urban legends. Several stories of werewolves or witches that murdered these people came to mind. And yeah, after seeing the brutality of this, who could blame them? So following this, police began their investigation. And investigation standards in 1922 were not what they are today. For one, the police made their headquarters at the Hinterkaifeck farm, and they interviewed everyone or interrogated everyone at the dining room table. On April the 6th, a couple of days after the bodies were found, the coroner came and performed his autopsy in the barn on a makeshift table next to where they were
Can be
murdered,
wired, charging rate, it's depending on power in with maximum 80%
all 6
efficiency.
heads were removed and sent to a clairvoyant to see if they could psychically tell anything from the heads. After that, the heads were kept in a nearby city as a part of evidence if a trial was to ever come of the murders. But it seems that the heads, along with a lot of the other documented evidence of what happened, were destroyed in 1944 during Allied bombings of Germany. That's another thing, because Germany went through a war just a couple of decades after this happened, a lot of the records have been lost to time. Without going into too much detail, or at least more than what's required, again, viewer discretion, this was the finding of the autopsy reports. Andreas had been severely hit across the face with such ferocity that part of his cheekbone was exposed, and it seems that the reason he died is because his carotid artery was injured and he bled out. Regardless of this, it seems that Andreas was only hit a single time, which cannot be said for most of the other victims. To start, it seems that Andreas's wife Cecilia had been strangled before the same heavy object that was used to hit Andreas was used to strike her across the face several times. Similarly, Victoria was also struck with a high level of ferocity. Along with the series of blows across her face, which left her horribly disfigured, it seems that there were several puncture wounds into her skull. And then the youngest daughter, Cecilia, who again was only 7 years old at the time, was not only struck by the same heavy object several times, but was also cut across her throat. And the autopsy determined that she was seemingly alive for several hours following, as she bled out and, again according to the autopsy, pulled out clumps of her own hair. And as haunting and terrible as it is to mention, it seemed that Cecilia was in a state of undress consistent with someone attempting to assault her in her final moments. The new maid, Miss Baumgartner, was found laying on the floor in her bedroom and had been struck across the face back and forth several times, again by the same heavy-handed weapon. And then the 2-year-old Joseph was found in his stroller, as it seemed the perpetrator raised the heavy weapon and then brought it down through the top of the stroller, killing Joseph in a single blow to the head. Initially, it was believed that the weapon that was most likely used was a pickaxe, because the weight and type of injury seemed consistent with that sort of weapon. It would later be determined that in actuality a mattock was used, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, during the initial investigation, the police found several patches of hay up in the hayloft that seemed to be patted down. In other words, it seems that someone was sleeping on the hay since the hay had been moved. In other words, between the time someone fed the animals and now, someone slept on the hay. Furthermore, it seemed that someone had defecated in the hayloft and had moved tiles around in the floor of the hayloft in order to see the ground beneath them. This, in combination with pieces of food found around the premises, as well as the report mentioned earlier that someone was running a stove on the night of April 1st, implies that after murdering the family, someone stayed there with them. Now, there are a few reasons this could be. For one, on the night of March the 31st, a huge blizzard hit, leading investigators to believe that perhaps whoever snuck into the house to kill the family was trapped by the snow and had to wait for it to melt. It's also worth mentioning that there seemed to be a lot of holes in the police's investigation. Like, even aside from mentioning all of the lack of care when it came to the evidence, there are some other details that seem to be just wrong. For example, yes, it does seem that whoever killed the family stayed in the house because of things like the defecation in the hayloft and the hay being laid down, and there was some food found in the hayloft. But one of the police's main points for this is that a lot of food was missing from the food storage of the Gruber family, when in reality it seems that a lot of that was Lorenz's fault. See, while people were staying there and while police were staying there initially and a bunch of people were coming to look, I guess in order to be kind, Lorenz just kind of started handing food out to people. And even though the police seemed to be aware of this and even accepted some of the food...
I just need a fuse. I just need a fuse.
Even though the police knew this, they logged the missing food as evidence that a lot of people probably killed the family and were here for a really long time. Furthermore, on April the 6th, again 2 days after the bodies were found and the same day the autopsy was performed, the police make the first mention of a rope that leads down from the hayloft to the ground floor. More specifically, the kind of attic area that's hidden away from the open hayloft that would be harder to see if you were walking around on the ground. So, in other words, there was a dangling rope in front of them for 2 days, and then one day they go, oh, there's a rope here. Someone write that down. Either they just didn't think to mention it or didn't notice it for a couple of days, or with all of the people poking around the house, someone crawled up to the attic and pushed the rope out. Either way, it seems that there was a rope that led from the attic to the ground floor, meaning that there might have been another way for someone to get to the hayloft of the barn to the ground floor without going on the ladder that was on the outside of the building, or in other words, exposed to prying eyes. A lot of their investigation was kind of like subjective too. Like, for example, at one point they were trying to determine if someone could hear a scream from the barn from inside of the living room. So one of them just went to the barn and yelled, and then all the guys inside said, nope, we didn't hear that. So they just wrote down that it was unlikely that someone from the barn screamed or called out to get other people to come in there. And it's like, okay, but like, how loud did the guy scream? Or like, were you listening that hard? Were you talking to someone else when he screamed? Like, that's not how we do experiments, but whatever. From the several interrogations and interviews that the police performed in the dining room of the Heiter Kaifek farm, the story of the farm itself came to light, as tragic as it was. The most apparent thing that came out of these interviews is that the Gruber family was not a good one. The majority of people around town just had stories about the family being generally unpolite or kind of kept to themselves and didn't talk to a lot of neighbors. But those who knew the family had much darker stories about them. For one, Victoria was the only daughter of Andreas and Cecilia. But according to those, she was just the only one that survived. Several accounts, including that of Carl Gabriel, again, he is the guy that was married to Victoria for a time, had stated that the Grubers had more children, at least one known of, a girl named Sophie, but that when the children misbehaved, they would go long periods of time without eating and were often locked in a cellar for days on end. And that many of the children died of malnutrition and disease, and Victoria was just the one that lived. To clarify, Carl Gabriel had told people of this before he went to World War I. He did not give a testimony to the police 4 years after his death from beyond the grave. And if it wasn't bad enough that Victoria was the family's only surviving daughter, Andreas would frequently have sexual relations with her. In 1915, Andreas served a short stint in jail for incest. This is also the reason that despite Andreas' suspicions, he never brought anything to the police, because he already had bad interactions with the police after being arrested for incest. And a few years later would have another charge put against him for incest by Lorenz Schlittenbauer, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Lorenz told police that Victoria told him since she was 16 years old, her father began having relations with her, and had tried even earlier. So much so that it was widely believed throughout the town, and officially known for a while, that the 2-year-old Joseph was actually the child of Victoria and her father Andreas. This was just a known fact throughout the town, and as you could imagine, a lot of people hated the Gruber family because of it. Or at the very least, they hated Andreas. Even if a lot of people just knew this to be a rumor, what they did know about the family is that they were said to have a lot of money. And this makes sense as they seemingly had a large farm, and Cecilia's family came from money, but the Grubers, at least outwardly, were very stingy. They would pay workers what they were owed, but not a drop more. And if they did provide
just fucking
food for
buy it.
people,
I should
was
just buy
always
it
the
too,
bare minimum. This was actually something stated by Carl Gabriel.
Water barrel.
After Carl married Victoria, it seems that he was immediately in over his head. He told his family stories of things like the Grubers having several children that died in the cellar. And he found out that his new wife had previously been forced into relations by her father, and that the family overall was generally unfriendly, had bad food, and were horrible to be around. As a matter of fact, just before the war, Carl had already been talking about divorce. So it was always said throughout the town that there was a ton of money hidden at the Hinterkaifeck farm. And this led police to what they believed to be the motivation for the killing: money. And on the surface, that makes a lot of sense, right? You have this stingy family in town that no one cares about, and they're said to have a lot of money on the property. So anyone would have to do is break into the house, steal the money, and they're home free. And perhaps they ran into members of the family when this happened and could leave no witnesses. However, there's still a few holes with this idea. For one, and again, this is an unsolved murder, but spoilers, I guess, a year after this, there were no charges and no one was convicted of it, so the farm passed off to family members who would demolish the property. In the demolishing, they found in the attic of the house a mattock handle that was covered in human hair and blood and determined to be the murder weapon. It was a mattock handle that Andreas had and had kept in his barn. He had kind of modified it to be like a club that would be used in trench fighting during World War I. So does that mean that people broke into the house to steal money but didn't bring a weapon, but when they found a weapon in the barn were then determined to kill everyone in the house? Also, the ferocity of the murders doesn't exactly seem like someone who's just covering up evidence. Sure, maybe on Andreas's part because he was just struck once, but the women were ferociously attacked. And of course, needless to say, if your concern is getting rid of witnesses, then why on earth would you kill a 2-year-old child? But perhaps most importantly, to poke a hole in this theory, money wasn't missing. Sure, it's estimated that around 100,000 marks were missing from Victoria's personal stash, but throughout the rest of the house, they found things like gold and expensive jewelry and silver coins. You know, the kind of thing if you just murdered an entire family, you would probably take the time to pick up. While a bunch of Victoria's belongings were lying on her bed as if someone was going through them for some reason, you would think someone that is there to murder a family and then hang out for a few days would check a jewelry drawer. So police kind of reframed their thinking. Maybe then it was just a serial killer. And sure, this does kind of make sense, especially with the more demented details of the case, like killing a child or sticking around the dead bodies for at least a day afterwards. And there's a lot of people to this day who espouse this as their primary theory. They'll connect it to other serial killers in the region or other like spree killings that were happening during this time. The book The Man from the Train asserts that an American serial killer by the name of Paul Mueller, who disappeared around 1912, may have traveled to Europe and committed this massacre, as a lot of the killings he is suspected to be tied to have similarities with the Hinterkaifeck massacre. But even with the serial killer angle, there are still some problems that arise out of that theory. For example, why stick around? Sure, maybe stick around the night you committed the murders because, as mentioned, there was a blizzard outside, but why stick around to eat food and sleep in the hayloft or burn something in the oven, according to the one witness? For one, despite all of this believing to have happened on the night of March the 31st, which is indicated by a lot of things like Cecilia missing school the next day, and Maria being found dead in her bed that she had just arrived to with her bag still unpacked, and everyone being found dead in their night clothes. Despite it being clear this happened on March the 31st, the calendar in the kitchen was flipped to April the 1st. On top of that, after the mailman delivered mail to the address on April the 1st, by April the 4th, someone had moved it to the inside window of the living room, which was the place that Andreas would always stash the newspaper. Furthermore, and this is kind of murky because documentation of this wasn't perfect, but it seems that between April the 1st and April the 4th, someone had moved the dog from a post tied out like further away from the house to right at the front door, which again is what the family would do whenever they were out from the house for the day. So it seems that whoever was around the house after the murders
they ain't
took
got no
place
water.
was familiar with the Gruber's habits. Another detail that isn't confirmed but is rumored is that in the corner of the barn there was about a shovel-deep trench that was attempted to be dug out, as if someone was starting to dig a hole in the barn before deciding to instead put the bodies underneath the hay. So why would a random serial killer change the calendar date, put the newspaper on the inside of the window, move the dog around, and then attempt to bury the bodies in a property they have no connection to? Because sure, you want as much time between the police finding the bodies and you having a chance to get as far away as possible, I get that. But if you're so concerned about delaying the time until the bodies are found, why stick around? Sure, the whole someone stayed with the body for 4 days is thrown again because of the police logging all the missing food that they ate, and considering that to be a group of people who stuck around the bodies for too long. But it seems that whoever was there was around for at least a day or two. Another thing that happened with the Heinter Kaifek case is it became the story to be talked about. People, during the investigation, were literally taking trains from towns outside of the area to come visit the murder site and just gawk and point at the place where the body used to be, I guess. Because of that, it seems that the police had a lot of leads, but they weren't all good leads. For one, every homeless person in the region immediately became a suspect, because since the police said a vagrant might be responsible, a lot of people just started making up stories about, oh, I was out in town and then someone ran by and said they killed the whole family and then they ran off into the woods or something. There was a woman in the 1940s who went to a priest and wrote on a piece of paper that her brothers are responsible for the killings, and then on her deathbed again said that they were responsible for the killings. Those brothers were Anton and Adolf Gump. Adolf Gump is an insane name. But the police interviewed the brothers, and it seems one was dead and the other one had zero connection and had never been in the region. There were a few cases like that of people randomly saying someone they know was the murderers because they told them one time under a certain circumstance, but every single suspect that they looked into had an alibi or wasn't in the area at the time. There are even some people who were temporarily jailed over such suspicions.
Am I gonna have to run all the way over there?
For the murders. As mentioned, a year later, possession of the property would pass on to family members of the Grubers who decided to destroy the farm because, who would want to live there? And it was during the destruction of the property that the mattock I mentioned earlier was found, as well as a small pocket knife, both of which seemed to be hidden in the attic above the house itself. The pocket knife seemingly being what was used on young Cecilia. So whoever killed them, after having killed everyone, threw the murder weapons
Do you
up
need
into
a drone?
the
Use a
attic
computer
house.
station.
Which again, if it was just a random passerby, why would they leave the
Terminal at
evidence with their
safe
fingerprints on it?
zone.
Which
Oh
fingerprints were
shit,
a
so
thing
I'm gonna
at
have
the
to run
time.
all the way over there.
Why
Okay.
would, you wouldn't think so with this case with everyone touching everything, but still. Why would someone who was just passing through to murder a family leave the murder weapon on the murder site? As mentioned, nothing conclusive would ever come from the case, but there are certainly some theories. For one, it seemed that Victoria knew something was up. 2 weeks prior to the murder, she had placed 700 gold marks in the church confessional. The priest found 700 gold marks in the confessional and knew that Victoria was the only member of the church who was well off enough to do that, and after asking her, she admitted that it was her. Not only that, but in the weeks leading up to the case, she had closed several savings accounts and bank accounts after withdrawing the cash. This is why it's believed that 100,000 marks were stolen from Victoria's personal inventory at the house, because despite taking all of this money out, it seems that she never spent it anywhere and no one could ever find it. I guess it is possible that someone who knew she had withdrawn all of this money came to the house to kill everyone and take it, but why would you take, the one stack of cash you know about and not grab all the other stacks of gold throughout the house? Again, the family seemed to be rather well off and the farm was in Victoria's name. On top of that, one of 7-year-old Cecilia's classmates would be interviewed years later. This classmate said that on March the 30th, again the day before the murders, Cecilia came to school very tired. Cecilia told her friend that the night before, her grandfather, Andreas, slapped Victoria, Cecilia's mom, and that Victoria ran away from the house crying into the woods, and that the family was out all night looking for her, only finding her in the early hours of the morning. So, a couple days before the murder, Victoria was in such dire straits with her father that she ran away from the house in the middle of the cold winter night. Or maybe March 30th isn't technically winter. It was cold outside. It's for these reasons that most of the theories around what happened at the Hinterkaifeck massacre revolve around Victoria. And I, for one, think that it makes the most sense. For one, she was the only member of the family who ever really got out of the house and interacted with people. And also, she seemed to be the only one that was doing anything suspicious before the murders happened. With that being said, there are 3 primary suspects that get talked about in relation to this case. Again, if you put aside the ones that are saying this is a sort of serial killing or a robbery gone wrong that just by coincidence happened to this family. But given some of the circumstantial evidence that I talked about earlier, I think that it is more likely that whoever murdered this family knew them, and that this killing was very personal. The first suspect that got talked about a lot when all of this happened is also the fun one. And that suspect is Carl Gabriel. That is right, Victoria's husband, who supposedly died in the trenches during World War I. It was not uncommon at the time for soldiers to be reported dead and then just show up back home. I mean, think about it. You have these massive, charges across trench lines or chemical weapon attacks, and seemingly entire battalions get wiped out at once. Well, the soldiers there would be presumed dead, but if they were actually alive, they have no way to communicate that to their family until they just catch a train and ride home. So the theory floating around town for a time. Again, it was a known fact that Andreas was having relations with his daughter, and that supposedly that's where the 2-year-old child came from. The theory that was floating around is that Carl returned from the war having been presumed dead and was furious to find that Victoria had had a child. So in a fit of rage, Carl picked up a mattock and killed his former wife, as well as the rest of her family, and his own daughter, as well as the illegitimate child of his former wife and her father. Now, even if we play with the whole theory that Carl survived the war, this seems kind of implausible. For one, as mentioned, Carl was already talking about divorcing Victoria before he shipped out to the war. So then why, after several years, would he decide he was so angry about her current situation that he has to kill her? As well as, and I can't stress this enough, his own 7-year-old daughter. Also, there have never been any records of him surviving or him showing up in town afterwards. So did he just walk from the front line to his house to kill his family and then just walk somewhere else? One of the main reasons that this theory gets talked about so much is during World War II, the theory made a resurgence.
Here it is.
A German soldier had claimed that he was held captive by Russian soldiers where he met Carl Gabriel, who was now a Russian commander. The German soldier told this whole story that while he was a prisoner of war, there was a Russian commander who spoke fluent German and sounded like he was from the area. And then after realizing the prisoner was from the area, the commander asked if he knew of the Hinterkaifeck murders, and the prisoner said yes, and the commander said, I am the one who committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. And that he explained himself to be Carl Gabriel, and then let this German soldier, as well as 2 other German soldiers, go so that they could go back to the town and report this story so that an innocent man would not be charged for the murders. Now, there's some problems with this. For one, when the investigation was happening right after the murders, the police looked into the Carl Gabriel idea and got full confirmation from the German military that yes, he died in World War I. On top of that, according to the German prisoners, the reason he became a Russian commander is because he was so vicious and fierce that the Russians liked him and decided to make him a commander. But if there was one thing that the Russians really weren't fans of during World War II, it was, Germans. And why would the guy who massacred his own wife, child, and family and was now supposedly a Russian commander because he was so evil and vicious or whatever, let these 3 go so that they could keep an innocent man from being tried for his crimes? Obviously, it sounds like a tall tale made up by some soldiers who wanted some publicity, right? But nevertheless, the Carl Gabriel theory comes up a lot whenever you read about this case. With that out of the way, there are 2 primary suspects who get talked about in this case more than anyone else. And one of them is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Now, a lot of you guys were probably listening to this whole story and saying to yourself over and over, oh, so Lorenz did it, right? Because he was the first one who showed up on the crime scene, he was the one who was accidentally messing with evidence, he was the one who knew the family, and perhaps most interestingly, he is the one who, officially at least, was the father of Joseph. So, I need to rewind a little bit for this to make sense. While Lorenz had his problems with the Gruber family, he always had a fondness for Victoria. The two of them had talked to each other on a few occasions, and according to Lorenz, after just a few times of speaking to each other, Victoria offered to go to bed with him. Lorenz was taken back by this, as he was married at the time, and denied her offer, but a few years later, when Lorenz's wife died of cancer in 1918, him and Victoria seemed to start a relationship. One kind of heartbreaking note is Lorenz, as well as several of the men who were interviewed by police during this whole thing, made remarks that Victoria was easy and especially promiscuous and whatnot, which, given the amount of trauma that poor girl went through, is heartbreaking. I'll talk about more at the end, but I don't think there's anyone, except maybe the children, of course, that I feel as bad for in this case as Victoria. So Lorenz and Victoria had a relationship and began seeing each other on and off. At one point, Victoria even brings up the idea of marriage, and Lorenz agrees. However, it is then that Victoria
high quality
tells him
metal
that
fragments.
she's pregnant. Again, all this is around 1919, 1920. Now, Lorenz knew, and it was common knowledge throughout the town, that Andreas had had incestuous relations with Victoria. And according to people like Crescens, the maid who quit earlier, even after Andreas had his stint in jail, it was not uncommon for him to abuse his own daughter. So Lorenz says that it might be my child that you're pregnant with, but it just might as well be your father's. And Lorenz decides that he will not claim the child
God damn it.
and reports Andreas to the police again for incest. After Andreas is jailed, Victoria begs Lorenz to take responsibility for the child's paternity. Both because it would be a better standing for Victoria
Water
in the
purifier.
public eye to have a
Do
child
I
with
have
someone
enough?
that
I
isn't
didn't
her
even know I
father,
could make
and
those.
it would also bode well for the child itself to not be known as the son of his grandfather.
Oh, I do. What?
So Lorenz claims paternity, but then there becomes a whole fight between the family and Lorenz as far as child
Also, I need
support goes.
cloth.
With the family saying that Victoria is owed this much and Lorenz saying she's not, and it goes back and forth for a while before Victoria eventually drops it. At one point, Lorenz brings up the idea to the family that he wants to marry Victoria, and initially the family is in approval of it, before one day, Andrea says no. Apparently, at one point, Lorenz had came to the family and said that he would marry her if Andreas stopped having incestuous relationships with her, and Andreas said something to the effect of, "We'll see." You know, Andreas really needed to get beat to death with a pickaxe, but it's a shame the rest of his family had to die as well. Based on some comments that Andreas made to people and his behavior, it seems that he didn't want anyone to have Victoria but him. Just a few days before the massacre, on March the 26th, one of Lorenz's youngest daughters would die of whooping cough. So, several people believe that just a few days later, perhaps he was fed up with his relationship with the Gruber family, decided to confront them, and a fight broke out that resulted in him massacring the family, including Andreas, who caused this trouble, and Victoria, who he may have saw as responsible for all of this, and killing the child that he saw as an illegitimate son of the woman he wanted to marry and the father who prevented it. And it is safe to say that a lot of Lorenz's behavior was suspicious. As mentioned, during the hours following the crime, there were way too many people there and they were touching way too much stuff. And Lorenz seemed to be encouraging this by handing out pieces of food and encouraging people to eat. And as the investigation was underway, Lorenz kind of acted like a tour guide, telling them what to think about the people in town, who they should interrogate, etc.
We're getting somewhere.
It was public knowledge that Lorenz had a lot of problems with the Gruber, so if all of them disappeared, that would be great for him. Lorenz was also incredibly knowledgeable about the case. He knew every detail by heart, and the whole detail about someone tried to dig a hole in the barn, but were unable to and just covered the bodies in hay, that came from him. After the barn was demolished, he was speaking to an onlooker when he said the ground was too hard to dig, so they must have covered the bodies in hay. Not only that, but according to witnesses, years later in a pub when the topic of the Hinterkaifeck murders were being discussed, and someone asked why the footsteps worked one way through the snow to the house but not back out, Lorenz said, "I simply walk backwards through my own footprints in the snow." Now, he immediately clarified when asked about this that he was saying "I" in an as if I was the killer voice. But this, as well as several murmurings throughout the town that Lorenz, being an important town official and very well off, very well might have committed the crimes and then threatened other people to be silent, lest they get into some kind of legal trouble. As a matter of fact, one of the two men that Lorenz brought to the farm on the day of the murders would later say that they think Lorenz did it and brought them there as an alibi to say that he was the first one who showed up. I mean, remember the detail about whenever they get to the barn, Lorenz goes through the house and then unlocks the door? Well, he unlocked the door with a key. Remember how Andreas had said that a key went missing in the days before the murders? Well, seemingly here that key is now in the door. And whenever Lorenz was asked about it, he said the key was already there. Or perhaps Lorenz stole a key and was now placing it here in order to act natural and gain access to the house, as he did perhaps when the murders took place. Now, a lot of people think Lorenz did it, and a lot of things like what I mentioned point towards him. But personally, I do not. And I have a few reasons for this. For one of the reasons that Lorenz was ruled out by investigators when the case first happened is that Lorenz had horrific asthma. And asthma is really an understatement. Lorenz was in World War I and was exposed to chemical gas like mustard gas. So his lungs were effectively crippled and he lost his wind very quickly. Doesn't seem like the kind of person that would have the capability to murder a family of 6. On top of that, yes, Lorenz knew a lot about the case, but he seemed to be more obsessed with the case than anyone else alive. Lorenz was there for every detail of it. Every time a bit of information was made public, he wanted to know it. According to his family, in the years following the massacre, Lorenz was destroyed by it. Not only did he seem to mourn the death of Victoria, at least in some part, but it destroyed his reputation. People around town would quit serving him. He wasn't allowed to do business with the other business owners. Everyone looked at him like a pariah. So it makes sense that someone whose life was so heavily affected by it would spend so much time thinking of the case. It would make sense that he would come to conclusions like, oh, well, the small patch of shovel-deep soil that was dug up was probably someone who tried to bury the bodies, but realized the ground was too hard. And then he just kind of spouts that information to whoever's willing to listen. Same with his assertion about the footprints leading to the barn. Also, that doesn't even make any sense. What would that even have to do? Are you saying that the killer made a set of footprints to the barn and then walked backwards through the footprints just to freak out the family and then made an entry at some other time? Like, that doesn't make sense.
And also,
as cheesy as it is to say, I think in some way that Lorenz cared about Victoria. Think about it. Not only had he agreed to marry her, but at this point he had taken responsibility for the child that very well might have not been his. He was willing to admit publicly to a court that he was the father of young Joseph, and he suffered the consequences for it. Lorenz said that his own son hated him for it. He hated that Lorenz, after the death of the son's mother, would sleep with another woman and have a child outside of his family. Not to mention the reproach that probably came from a small town when a well-to-do person hates acknowledgement of an illegitimate child. If the murders would have happened right after he said the child wasn't his and Andreas was being convicted again for incest, then maybe the idea of Lorenz murdering the family would have a point. But Lorenz went through all of that and then still tried to marry Victoria and claimed the baby. Also, if Lorenz was to murder them, why was he so especially brutal to Cecilia the grandmother, Victoria, and Cecilia the 7-year-old child? I mean, why would he try to undress her and then just give Andreas a single hit to the face? I think what is much more likely is that the third suspect we're going to talk about today is the one that I personally believe probably murdered the family. And that man is, of course, Andreas Gruber. So, Andreas, as we've established, very evil person, with the ability to kill children if the beliefs of his
select
children
an appropriate container in your inventory.
As we know, Lorenz was wanting to marry Victoria, and it seemed that Andreas wanted nothing to do with that. But in the weeks leading up to the massacre, it seemed that Victoria was withdrawing a lot of money. Maybe Victoria had some plans to run over to Lorenz's property and live with him. Maybe after the death of Lorenz's daughter, he tried to push her to do it quicker. Maybe that's why, according to the young Cecilia, on the night of March the 29th and morning of March the 30th, Andreas had hit Victoria, causing her to run into the woods. Maybe they have had a fight about Victoria and Lorenz being together. I mean, think about it. The murder weapon that was used on the family was the mattock that Andreas had constructed. So perhaps Victoria begins fighting him about it one night, and Andreas hits her and then doesn't quit hitting her. And then maybe because Victoria was out in the barn for too long, Cecilia came to check, and then Cecilia, her daughter, came to check, and Andreas murdered them one by one. And sadly, due to the young Cecilia's state of undress, I do know one person in this story who is willing to abuse their own daughter in that way, or their own granddaughter in that case. And then, of course, from there, he's already on a rampage and can't leave any witnesses, so he murders Baumgartner, who had just arrived earlier that night, and then, of course, murders the child that he feels is responsible for all this turmoil in the first place. This would explain a lot of things. This would explain why the newspaper was placed up in the window. This would explain why the calendar was flipped over to April the 1st. This would explain why the mattock and the pocket knife were thrown into the attic. It was the only place within his own home that Andreas could think to hide the weapons. Perhaps then, for the next couple days, not knowing what to do because he didn't have a plan to begin with, Andreas hides in the roof of the hayloft and the attic and watches people come to visit the house before they leave. This would explain the sleeping on the hay. This would explain defecating in the hayloft and the food that was eaten. It would also explain the casual attempt to dig a mass grave before just hiding the bodies in the hay. Heck, if you think Andreas's murder is premeditated, this even explains him going to his store the day before, saying he's seen weird people around the house, saying he's seen footsteps, saying that a key has gone missing. I mean, if Lorenz was right about the key being in the front door, then perhaps the key was never lost in the first place. Perhaps Andreas, after he had murdered everyone, locked every entry to the house because, again, the doorway into the barn was barred by a wooden block as well. Perhaps he locked every entry of the house and then went up to the attic, where the only way back down from there was through the rope that the police would mention on April the 6th. Perhaps Andreas just panicked and decided he was going to wait in there until something happened. The police even mentioned that despite the amount of trauma to the victims' faces, there was no spot where it looks like blood was pooled or a definitive spot where the murder happened. So maybe Andreas, in a panic, even tried to clean up some of the blood and then burn the rags, which would explain the smell of dirty rags as the witness described. Maybe Andreas, trying to get someone away from the property, was the one who walked out and held the lantern up to the witness's face. I believe all of that, and frankly to me, this is the version of the story that makes the most sense. This explains why someone would go through Victoria's stuff but not take any of the money in the rest of the house. Heck, maybe Andreas found the 100,000 marks that Victoria had stored and decided in rage to burn it along with the rags he used to try to clean up the blood. All of this makes perfect sense to me, and honestly, it's the version of the story I think to be most likely. Except for one little problem. Andreas was also murdered. So how could Andreas have murdered the whole family, and then Andreas himself also be murdered, along with the family? It's almost frustrating how well Andreas murdering the family is as a theory, except for the little detail that he died as well. As a matter of fact, there's one popular theory that after murdering the entire family, then hanging out in the house for a couple days, Andreas slipped and fell onto the mattock and just accidentally cut his face open and then died that way. And I guess decided to crawl through the hay to lie next to Victoria's body. But I think there is someone who may have been likely to murder Andreas, even after the rest of the family was killed. And I think it's someone we've already talked about. Lorenz. What if Andreas murdered his entire family and then in a panic begins to hide in the attic of the house or bumble his way through the house itself, not sure of what to do, when Lorenz, who was already in an argument, what if Lorenz, in a rage, gashed Andreas across the face and caused him to bleed out? Lorenz would have immediately recognized how the situation looks because now the murderer is dead and you are holding the murder weapon. So Lorenz simply places the body of Andreas next to Victoria and then throws the mattock handle up into the attic. Most see it suspicious as soon as Lorenz got to the property on April the 4th with his two witnesses that he quickly pulled out the body of Victoria, seemingly doing this to see if they were alive, but then not doing it to the two Cecilias who were covered up on the other side of the room. Perhaps Lorenz did this so that no evidence that maybe Andreas was laid onto Victoria's body days later could be brought forward. And if Andreas hadn't already done it, maybe Lorenz threw the mattock into the attic to hide after he had killed Andreas. To his deathbed, Lorenz would state that he was not responsible for the Hinterkaifeck murders, but maybe he was responsible for one of them. And if that's the case, I see no better cosmic justice for this, that the one who tried to take Victoria away from all of this is the one who avenged her death. But of course, all of that is just my theory. While I think it's most likely that Andreas murdered his family, it is just an idea that perhaps Lorenz was the one to kill Andreas. Because if Lorenz didn't, then I have no idea who would have. I mean, maybe you could say that somehow Andreas managed to strike his own face hard enough to cause that injury, but that seems unlikely. Or maybe the whole thing that he fell and tripped and cut up his face to death is true, in which case that would be kind of funny. Regardless of all of this, what we do know is that the 6 people at the Hinterkaifeck farm lost their lives, most of which tragically, again, aside from Andreas. And I don't know how culpable his wife Cecilia was in all the abuse that happened. I, of course, feel horrible for young Joseph and young Cecilia, children who suffered brutal, brutal deaths and did not deserve and probably couldn't comprehend any of it. And I also feel terrible for Victoria, a girl whose entire life sounds miserable and full of dread, and then to be killed in such a brutal way in her final moments. In 2007, a police academy in Germany did an entire reevaluation of the Hinterkaifeck case using new methods, whatever that means, and said that, for one, because of a lack of evidence, there will probably never be a way to prove what happened at the Hinterkaifeck farm. But that in their investigation, each of the researchers came to the same conclusion on the same suspect. But they would not release that information because they had some surviving descendants, which is the dumbest cop-out I think I've ever heard. Like, could you, imagine, like, could you, I know they don't know, it's just their guess about it, but to not say what the guess is because you're afraid that their great-grandson or whatever will get harassed for it, who would do that? Like, there's still great-grandchildren of, like, Lee Harvey Oswald or John Wilkes Booth, or I don't know if that guy had kids. Regardless, there are descendants of famous killers, and it's not like they get attacked. Just because you say you all think that this person did it doesn't mean their grandchildren will get. That's the dumbest reason to not release information ever. I hate it here. Okay. Regardless of all of that, I don't think we'll ever know for sure who murdered the family on March the 31st. And it's tragic and terrible, and there's really no good ending to it because we don't know who did it, and there's not closure for the victims that were lost, but hopefully in some small way we can remember at least Victoria and her children as people, and as people who certainly didn't deserve what they go to, and hopefully their souls are somewhere more at rest now than they were in this lifetime, except for Andreas. He absolutely deserved what he had coming. And with that, we have the end of what I think is the, if not the most disturbing, one of the most disturbing unsolved cases I've ever come across. I covered this way back when I did the Unsolved True Crime Iceberg, and ever since I first read about it, it has stuck with me and it's been in the back of my head, so I decided to read a book about it to see what else was there, and it's so much worse than I thought, and I feel so bad for Victoria and the family, and her kids, I mean. And yeah, it's a tragedy every way you look at it, but hopefully, you know, I don't know, this is a depressing video. There's no, like, good, you learned this, or this came of it, or whatever. Everyone's sad, and it's awful. Except maybe, you know what? If my interpretation of events is true, then Lorenz seemed to be an all right guy. And if he did murder Andreas, that's really cool of him to do that. But at the same time, I don't want to fully double down there because I'm just a YouTuber and can very well be wrong. And maybe Lorenz was actually the murderer because people smarter than me seem to think he is sometimes, and some other people think it's Andreas. I don't know. It's complicated. I'm going to stop talking. As gruesome as this story was, hopefully you enjoyed it. And I just want to say thank you for watching. I always feel weird covering these stories because, especially when we don't know anything for sure, I have to be careful about giving too much praise to one person or not enough to another. Again, I don't think Lorenz did it. I think Andreas did it. But I have to be careful because I can always be wrong, right? But yeah, this is a very depressing story, but it's something that stuck with me. And if something sticks with me for too long, I have to make a video about it or it just gets stuck in here and it's not good for my health. So this was that. And as depressing and terrible as it was, hopefully you enjoyed, hopefully you learned something, even if you had heard of this case before, and I greatly appreciate that. Thank you all for the support. Thank you so much for the views, the likes, the contributions. It means the world. You guys are great. I believe that should do it for now, but I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! You've likely heard it said that truth is stranger than fiction, and few cases make that as apparent as the tale of Daniel LaPlante. As bizarre as it sounds, a 17-year-old Daniel became obsessed with a girl he knew and hid in the wall of her home for 9 months, and would later go on to murder 3 people. The details of this entire case are nearly too shocking to be believed. Now, this story is so notorious within criminal history that it has become a sort of urban legend. Since the 1980s, it has been passed around and retold so many times that a lot of people have trouble keeping the facts straight. Because as you can imagine, the radical elements of the case make it a hotbed for rumors. While researching this case, I found that newspapers from the time would give 3 different versions of the same event, and some documentaries would flat out make up names for the people involved. So I decided to reach out to a man who is a reliable source for this case, that man being Joe Turner. Joe Turner wrote a book for this case that is yet to come out, as it is coinciding with the release of a documentary. As it turns out, when Joe began writing this book, he got first-hand accounts from nearly everyone involved with the case, and was able to put together a cohesive narrative with first-hand accounts. And after I made contact with him, he has been incredibly helpful in helping me piece out a correct timeline, as well as getting some facts straight. So check him out at joeturnerbooks.com and be sure to get a copy of his book regarding this case when it comes out, because he's really cool and I appreciate him. Also want to mention, a lot of the details of this case are pretty gnarly, from things like extreme stalking to, again, a triple homicide, so viewer discretion is advised. And the other thing I want to advise you on is my shameless merch plug, because the Camp Wendigoon collection with the t-shirt, squonk plush, pants, and hat are only going to be available for a few more days, so get them while you can. Today's topic has so many developments that are hard to believe, so if that sounds interesting to you, stick around after the ad as we break down the fact and fiction of the boy in the wall.
While you probably don't have anyone watching you from inside of your walls, you almost certainly have someone trying to watch you online. There's a high likelihood that there's someone watching your devices, your bank accounts, maybe even your social security number. That's because there's so many data breaches every year, and most of the time we don't know for months until after they happen. Take Bank of America, for example, who just announced a data breach that happened over 90 days ago. And on average, it takes a company 277 days to report a breach. Your bank could be breached right now, and you could be months away from learning about it. You don't want to give a criminal a 9-month head start, but that's where today's sponsor, Aura, is here to help. Aura constantly scans the dark web, breach databases, and even shady data brokers that buy and sell your information, looking for your personal details like your phone number, social security number, or email. They're going to send you an instant alert if anyone tries to use this information to access your credit or bank accounts. Not only that, but they give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst happen. That's peace of mind you won't get from just checking your credit score every now and then. But Aura isn't just about monitoring data breaches and ID theft. They bundle a VPN to keep your browsing private, scam call protection to stop those fake IRS or car warranty calls, and real-time transaction monitoring to help spot fraud before it drains your account. They even let you remove your info from those creepy data broker websites that love to collect and sell your personal details. Instead of juggling a bunch of different security tools, Aura gives you everything you need in one place. And right now, there's never been a better time to get in on this offer. Because right now, if you head to the link below at aura.com/Wendigoon, you can try Aura for 14 days absolutely free. There'll be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. You'll learn about it before one of these companies are forced to notify you. So quit looking over your shoulder and be sure that you're safe online. Again, that's 2 weeks of Aura for free at aura.com/Wendigoon to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad, and thank you to Aura for sponsoring the channel. We are now back to the video.
We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Daniel LaPlante was born May the 15th of 1970 in Townsend, Massachusetts, and from there, the troubles began. Daniel was born to Claude and Elaine LaPlante, and to say that their marriage was troubled would be an understatement. Claude seemed to be a violent man, and by the time Daniel was 2 years old, Claude began to abuse Daniel. Claude would often yell at or hit the child, and according to some sources, was convinced that the child wasn't even his. In 1974, when Daniel was only 4 years old, his father would go to jail for raping a woman. After Claude got out of jail, Elaine would stay married to him for about a year after. And a lot of people look really harshly on Elaine for this, but you also have to imagine if the abuse was that intense, Elaine was probably afraid of her husband to some extent. Eventually, Elaine went to live with her sister and then filed for divorce from Claude, but Claude tried to take full custody of the children. However, given his violent felony, that didn't go over too well with the judge, and on November 4th of 1977, Elaine was granted full custody of Daniel and his siblings. From here, Elaine would go on to remarry a man named David Moore, and the violence in the house would finally cease. That is, until Daniel got a little older. At first, Daniel's issues seemed to be typical of a kid who came from a rough home. He had trouble in school, seemed aggressive towards classmates, but as he got older, these problems became more severe. By the time Daniel got to high school, he had to transfer schools constantly. This was due to him failing classes, skipping school, and his behavioral issues. Years later, friends of Daniel's would say that by the time Daniel was 12 years old, he was already robbing stores. Now mind you, these were never robberies where he had a gun or threatened anyone outright or anything that could get him in trouble with the law explicitly. But from a young age, the police suspected him and could just never prove anything. As a matter of fact, we didn't know these for sure until the friends that he robbed the stores with would tell people years later. Those same friends would later say that when Daniel was a young teenager, he would do things like torture small animals or commit acts of arson. And for a long time, Daniel was able to keep these tendencies of his hidden, at least for the most part. Those who knew him passively say that he gave off a menacing tone. And while some of these things are understandable for, guys in high school, things like heavy metal or scary movies, other things like bringing porn magazines everywhere he went, or being really into Nazi memorabilia raised a few red flags. While bouncing from school to school, Daniel would eventually see a psychiatrist while attending St. Bernard High School. This psychiatrist would be the first time that Daniel was really examined. And there he was diagnosed with some learning disabilities like dyslexia and ADD.
I want to double check that I was right about this part before I misspoke. He wasn't diagnosed with ADD per se. It was the 1980s, so he was diagnosed with hyperactivity, which the modern equivalent of that is ADHD. But in the 1980s, hyperactivity was also kind of an umbrella term for a lot of behavioral issues that people, especially children, would have. So when he was 15, he was formally diagnosed with hyperactivity and dyslexia. Other than that, and eventually being found fit to stand trial, those are the only diagnoses that Daniel would ever have. That being said, in the years following this case, several of the psychiatrists who worked with Daniel would say that he most likely has a cluster B personality disorder. And again, while this isn't an official diagnosis by any means, this tends to be the common through line that a lot of doctors say and also makes the most sense given the case. The four main cluster B personality disorders are antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder, with most people saying that Daniel tends to lean towards the borderline personality disorder or BPD. Untreated BPD will often lead to symptoms like impulsiveness, risk-seeking behavior, sudden outbursts of violence, all things that will become apparent through this case. While borderline personality disorder is most often attributed to one's environment, there is a lot of research to indicate that it is at least partially genetic as well. And given Daniel's biological father's behavior, that would make sense.
And it's here we hit our first major point of contention in this story. Daniel would later go on to say, and this would be widely circulated by press at the time, as well as articles that would follow for decades. Daniel has stated that he was sexually abused by his birth father, his stepfather, and his psychiatrist. And in the majority of sources you'll read, this is presented as fact. However, these allegations have never had any evidence or even been stated by anyone originally other than Daniel. Now, his birth father can be more believable. We know from his siblings and family that Daniel's birth father was physically abusive and verbally abusive. And while Daniel's family says that his birth father was never sexually abusive, given what his father would later be charged for, that's not outside of the realm of possibility. However, given Daniel's habits of lying and violence and causing trouble, we can't really call him a reliable witness. Because other than his own account, there's never been allegations, to my knowledge, made about his stepfather or the psychiatrist. So that begs the question, why then is this account so widely reported? And I think it's because it makes sense, or at least feels better, if Daniel had some reason to do the things he would later do. Not a justification by any means, but at least an explanation as to where the evil came from. I mean, how many times have we heard stories of people who grow up to become deviants or criminals only became that way because of things that happened to them? And while yes, Daniel seemed to have a very negative influence in his life at an early age due to his abusive father, it doesn't seem that this negative influence occurred throughout the rest of Daniel's life leading up to his crimes as he would want people to believe. And a lot of people try to group violent mental conditions like this into two camps. Either you're born with it and you're simply broken forever and that person's just going to be a bad egg, or this person had a lot of trauma throughout their life, and that's the reason that they're the way they are. And I think Daniel, at least in my unqualified opinion, falls into a sort of
500
gray area
metal
down the middle.
fragments.
There are plenty of people who are diagnosed with the scary mental conditions from a very early age, things like psychopathy or sociopathy, who go on to live peaceful, non-violent lives because of the guidance they have around them. Sure, living without impulses like empathy can be very difficult, but if you have a network of people around you who want to help you, those people can succeed. And people who are subjected to heavy amounts of abuse and evil are not predestined to become that same evil. However, Daniel seems to have fallen in the worst camp of both options. If the diagnosis is correct, he was born with a condition that it would take a lot of labor and love to pull him out of. And in contrast, he was born to a physically abusive father. I don't believe Daniel to have been cursed from birth. I think there certainly might have been an option with the correct direction for him to live a peaceful, happy life. But instead, a violent influence accelerated any condition he already had. I'm of course not arguing that Daniel wasn't responsible for the actions he would later do. I agree with the court's ruling that he was fully knowledgeable about the wickedness of the crimes he would eventually commit. But what I am saying is that his diagnosis, along with this early influence, was a recipe for disaster, as everyone else would soon find. The first signs of what Daniel would go on to do came in how he treated women. Daniel seemed to have a habit of groping girls in public, either girls at his school or girls out at restaurants. It's kind of insane to just casually say that, because I feel like if that kind of thing happened today, it would immediately become a problem. But I guess in the 1980s, it was like, you know, boys will be boys. He's not smoking weed, is he? If something this heinous is what Daniel was doing in public, then, as you could imagine, it was much worse in private. Daniel had a friend, and at his friend's house, they would regularly invite over girls and assault them. The details on this are murky. I imagine alcohol or drugs was used to some degree. As far as we know, according to Joe Turner, only one girl ever went to the police with this. This victim was invited to the friend's house, went there and was assaulted, and then went to the police, who went so far as to search the house itself. But according to her, despite being in the room where the assault happened, the police didn't do anything about it, stating that it was effectively her word against theirs, and Daniel never got in trouble for this. Again, the police probably just showed up, made sure there wasn't weed, and then left. Around 1985, at the age of 15, Daniel developed the disturbing habit of breaking into people's homes. Sometimes he would steal things, other times he would move things around, and sometimes he would just stand there. Daniel seemed to have a fascination with other infamous criminals, one of them being Charles Manson. And Charles Manson would have his followers break into people's homes to get them comfortable with the act of breaking into people's homes. So maybe Daniel took inspiration from that. Getting in and out of people's houses unseen became a regular occurrence for him, something that he got really good at. In 1986, Daniel, now 16 years old, would kick off the series of events that he is now most known for. And it all began when he developed an infatuation with a 15-year-old Tina Bowen. In 1986, Tina Bowen was 15 years old and lived with her two younger sisters, Karen and Kathy, and lived in a single-parent household with her father, Frank, as her mother, Ruth, had recently died of cancer. Now, we're not exactly sure how Daniel picked Tina as a target. It's been said that Tina had a habit of writing down her phone number and handing them out to boys in town, so it's most likely that Daniel saw her at some point and managed to get a hold of this phone number. So one night Daniel calls her and the two begin talking. See, Daniel and Tina went to different schools, so Daniel uses his real name but describes himself as a tall, athletic, blonde-haired guy who's academic and interested in her. After a few phone conversations, the two plan a date. However, when the night of this date arrives, Tina realizes that she's been catfished. Daniel comes to her house to take her on a date. By most accounts I've read, it's to go to a fair that was in Townsend. And when Daniel arrives, Tina sees that he is not at all like the person he described on the phone. Now, while it is certainly true that Daniel catfished about his appearance, some sources will take this detail a bit too far. A lot of sources you'll read will describe Daniel as being overweight and out of shape and generally hideous. But despite his unwelcoming demeanor, Daniel played track and football throughout high school, despite jumping from school to school frequently. He had an athletic build and potential to be attractive, he just didn't take care of himself. He was said to wash infrequently and smell constantly. Friends of his would later say that he would wear the same clothes over and over again. So he would go to football practice and get a shirt sweaty, and then the next day just put the same shirt back on. Because of this, he had greasy hair, an acne-ridden face, but due to his athletics, this was combined with a competent build, pointing to the fact that Daniel probably could have got the female attention he was looking for if he put any effort into it. And wasn't evil. So Tina, despite her apprehensions, decides to go on this date with Daniel. She would later say that it was really weird because Daniel was obsessed with the thought of Tina's dead mother. As soon as Daniel found out that Tina's mother was dead, he just kept asking questions about how much she suffered, how Tina felt watching her die, what it's like to have a dead parent. Tina was, as you could imagine, generally creeped out by this and decided to leave the date early. Now, a lot of accounts say that this is the last time Tina ever spoke to Daniel, but according to Tina, they saw each other a couple of times after this. There was at least one instance of her father taking the two of them to the movies, and one occasion of Daniel coming over for a family dinner. It seems that although Tina was no longer interested in him, she tried to maintain a friendship with him, most likely because she felt bad for him because, as far as Tina knows, this guy's just an outcast who has trouble making friends. But it seems he was even off-putting in the friend zone, so she pushed him out of even that and began to break contact. But little did Tina know that the damage had already been done. Some months later, in January of 1986, Tina and her two sisters decided to have a seance. Now, I know that probably sounds out of nowhere, but you've got to understand in the 1980s, girls couldn't stare at TikTok for 6 hours. So a lot of high school girls would just do whatever was trendy at the time, or whatever the in moment was.
Hey, me again on the editor side. So it turns out this seance wasn't in January of 1986. The first instance that the Bowen girls had that was suspicious was in March of 1986. And the seance happened sometime over the summer.
We got a ton of water.
They all kind of like snowballed off of each other. But regardless, the first instance was in March, not January. I guess whoever said January made it up. Could have been me. Who knows?
And in the 1980s, it was the height of horror movies and the satanic panic. Stories of Ouija boards and contacting the supernatural were all the rage. So Tina and her sisters decide to light some candles and have a seance to see if they can contact their mom. That night, as they're asking questions, according to the sisters, they heard knocking coming from the walls. According to them, they would ask a question and then hear knocking in answer to that question, leading the girls to freak out and believe that they had, in fact, summoned the spirit of their mother. And even as they blew out the candles and went to bed, they said that they could hear knocking in the wall through the night. But as the days went on, the knocking didn't stop. As a matter of fact, the knocking in the walls got to be so much that it would regularly keep the girls up at night. And after this, strange things would continue to happen. The girls would leave a room and come back later to find that the furniture had been moved, that pictures had been knocked off the wall. Their clothes would be moved around their bedroom, things pulled out of drawers. Because of this, the girls believed that the house was haunted and that instead of contacting their mother, they had in fact contacted a demon. They told their father about this, and Frank, as any father would, just assumed that the girls had an active imagination. I mean, think about it. The girls had just lost their mother and then had tried a seance and then said that the house was haunted, and everything that's happened in the house so far can be chalked up to girls playing a sort of practical joke on each other. I certainly can't blame Frank for dismissing this as just that. This went on for several months. The girls had several bizarre instances. One night, one of the girls woke up and said that breadcrumbs were sprinkled on her face. Other bizarre things would happen, like at one point they found their mother's wedding dress laid across a bed. At one point they found a trail of pennies leading down the staircase. They woke up one day to find that someone had peed in the bathtub. At one point, the girls went into the basement of the home and found the words, "I'm in your room, come and find me," written on the wall in shaving foam. A few weeks later, Tina would find another message in shaving foam that said, "I'm back. Find me if you can." Frank wasn't home for the second occasion, so Tina ran to the nearby neighbor and called Frank at work, telling him to come home early. When Frank got home, he comforted Tina and said he was going to get her professional help. Again, believing this to all be in her head. Well, I guess the belief of there being a demon that's possessing the house to be in her head. The shaving foam wasn't in her head, it was on the wall. Now, it's important to emphasize that this didn't happen every night, but it happened enough to keep the girls paranoid. Tina would later recount that at one point she got up in the middle of the night and while walking through her house looked through the darkness, and with a flash of light from outside that Tina said came from a lightning strike in the midst of a storm, she saw the figure of someone sitting at the kitchen table. Finally, in December of 1986, the girls would meet the demon that had been haunting their home. Now, I've heard this part of the story told at least 5 different ways, so again, I'm going with Joe Turner's account, the guy who wrote a book that was a combination of various first-hand accounts. On December the 8th of 1986, Frank, Tina, Karen, and Kathy returned to the house after being out all day. When they arrived home, the house had been trashed. Furniture was pushed across the room, clothes were thrown everywhere. Frank, as you could imagine, blames the girls and asks why they trashed the house, to which the girls say that it was probably the demon. Frank, as you could imagine, became upset at the girls, but the girls said they didn't do it. So Frank walked through the house, throwing open doors and shouting, "Oh, it must have been an intruder then. Come out, come out." And then, as he was sarcastically throwing open doors, he throws open the closet hallway to see a 17-year-old Daniel LaPlante standing there with face paint and a hatchet. This, as you can imagine, caused the whole family to panic as Daniel ordered everyone into the upstairs bedroom. Frank, being unable to stop this as he was unarmed, went with the three girls to the upstairs bedroom. As soon as they got into the bedroom, Frank barricaded the door and opened the window so that the girls could escape. Tina ran across the street to the neighbor's house where she called the police. The police arrived, but when they got there, Daniel was nowhere to be found. Now, while the family had seen Daniel before, Daniel again had his face painted and his hair spiked up, and the family didn't recognize him. So when the police got there, the family just said it was some crazed intruder and they didn't know who it could be. So Frank took the girls and went to stay with his eldest daughter who lived in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Now, we don't know for sure why Daniel ordered the family into the upstairs bedroom. If I had to guess, it's so he could have everyone in one place while he ran away. Because even if he did want to kill them, he probably knew that, even with a hatchet, he would have a hard time overpowering Frank. And it seems that for the time being, Daniel successfully got away until 2 days later. Because 2 days later, on December the 10th, Frank and the three girls decide to go back to the house in order to get some things. Because what are the possibilities of the guy coming back, right? On December the 10th, when Frank pulled into the driveway, he looked in the window of his home and saw someone's face. Frank immediately drove to the neighbor's house and called the police again. When the police arrived, they found that the house was once again vandalized. There was a kitchen knife shoved through a picture of Tina that hung on the wall, and written on the wall in magic marker was the phrase, "I'm still here, come find me." And then on another wall written in magic marker was the phrase, "I'm going to kill you all." While in the basement of the house, one of the officers found a loose wall that led to a partition that hid the plumbing pipes for the house itself. When the officer moved the wall, he saw a giant pile of clothes. As he reached in and tore away some of the clothes, he saw someone's arm hanging out. Quickly, the officers grabbed the arm, ripped whoever it was out of the wall to find Daniel LaPlante holding a wrench. And it was here that Daniel LaPlante was finally arrested after hiding in the Bowen house for a year.
Or, you know, it would have been a year if it started in January, but it actually started in March. So like 9-10 months, whatever.
Now, there's a ton of myth and urban legends surrounding this case, so to make some of the facts clear, Daniel was not living in the Bowen house exclusively for an entire year. He would come and go from the Bowen house throughout the year. As mentioned, Daniel had a habit of living in people's houses unseen. So when he wanted to, he would go to the Bowen house that was about 8 miles from his own house in Townsend, and by either picking a lock or simply opening an unlocked door, made his way in and out of the house unseen. He would show up for a night, wait for everyone to be asleep, move stuff around, mess with the family, and then leave before he could be discovered. Another myth is that Daniel wasn't living in the walls. Instead, he lived sometimes in a wall. That partition in the basement, as far as we know, is the only place within the interior of the house that he ever hid inside of. Now, it was in the basement of the house, so when Daniel would knock on the wall in the basement, it sounded like it was throughout the walls of the whole house. So it's not like Daniel was moving in between the walls of the girls' bedrooms and things like that. He would just go hide down in the partition, make knocking noises to mess with them, and then leave the partition to do things around the house before going back down there to hide. Some other popular myths is that when Daniel was first discovered, he was dressed as a Native American. I assume this came from the face paint and the hatchet, but otherwise he was just dressed like Daniel. Other instances will say the words that were written on the wall were in ketchup to appear as blood, but as mentioned, it was actually shaving foam. And apparently, whenever the wedding dress was laid out on the bed, he had written "Marry Me" on the wall, or at least some accounts say that he had written "Marry Me" on the wall. And this has led to a more spectacular telling of what happened on December the 8th that says when Frank walked into his bedroom, he saw Daniel standing there in his dead wife's wedding dress with "Marry Me" written on the wall, also while holding a hatchet. It seems that this case was so popular when it happened and so over the top that people just started getting their creative writing juices out of the way. But again, the version I told is, to my knowledge, the way it took place. For a year, Daniel would break into the Bowen house and torment this family. But at least now, he was arrested. When he was arrested for breaking into the Bowen home, the officer that arrested him said that he took 10 mugshots because he knew he would need these pictures again. Just something about Daniel told the cop that this kid was going to be trouble. His charges were breaking and entering and attempted aggravated assault. While he definitely should have also got a stalking charge, I guess it was hard for the prosecution to argue that, as there wasn't like documented evidence with the police of this happening beforehand, because again, Frank just assumed all of this to be a trick that the girls were playing, and the girls believed it to be the devil. So since he was 17, Daniel was being held in a juvenile detention center, and the prosecution wanted to try him as an adult. His original defense attorney in this case was a man named Andrew Gustafson. But for reasons we don't know, Daniel fired Andrew and hired another attorney. Now, while we know with hindsight that Daniel was an incredibly violent and dangerous individual from all the accounts that would come out in the years to follow, at the time the only thing the courts knew of was this single breaking and entering event. And despite this event being disturbing, I suppose they chalked it up to the mind of a crazed teenager. So when the opportunity became available after spending 10 months in juvie, Daniel's mother Elaine posted his bail in October of 1987, with his court date set for 2 months later on December 11th. As soon as Daniel got back into his mother's custody, he began to do the same things he was doing before he was in police custody. He broke into multiple people's houses and in November stole 2 guns from a house he broke into. His stepfather found these guns and asked Daniel about it, who said he bought them from a friend. Despite the tragic number of chances people had to stop Daniel, no one did, and the consequences of that would be made known on December the 1st of 1987. Behind Daniel's home was a large patch of woods, and several of the houses in the area backed up to these woods. About half a mile through the trees was the Gustafson home, the same home of Andrew Gustafson, Daniel's original lawyer for the Bowen case. Now, it seems that the Gustafsons had suspected that someone had broken into their home prior to December 1st, as in November, there seemed to be signs of things within the house being moved around, meaning that, again, given his MO, Daniel had probably broken into the house previously. Andrew and his wife Priscilla, who was 33 years old and pregnant that December, lived in the house with their 5-year-old son William and their 8-year-old daughter Abigail. According to forensics, the following series of events happened on December the 1st. And again, viewer discretion is advised. While Andrew was at work, Daniel broke into the house and held Priscilla at gunpoint. He tied Priscilla face down to her bed and then filled up the bathtubs in the upstairs and downstairs bathroom and then drowned both of the Gustafson children, one in each bathtub. The reason he did this was probably to lead one away from the other so they wouldn't see what was about to happen to them. After killing the children, he then went back to Priscilla, who he violently assaulted, along with several pages of pornographic magazines that he had brought with him and condoms. After this, he used a pillow to suppress the sound and fired several shots into her head. It seems that during this, he just used things that were in the house, like opening a beer he found in the fridge, and then left the house only for Andrew to walk in and find the massacre a few hours later. Andrew walked into his home and wondered why it was suspiciously quiet, only to go to his bedroom and see his wife's body on the bed. He then left the house, went to the neighbor, and called the police. Later in court, Andrew was asked why he didn't go looking for his kids after finding his wife's body. And he said it's because he knew they were already dead. There were so many steps along the way where the system kept failing. If maybe when the first girl went to the police and said that Daniel a couple years earlier had assaulted her, maybe if they took her seriously and arrested him, that would have at least been on his record for when he got arrested for breaking and entering. And then maybe they would have taken the case more seriously. Maybe they would have tried him as an adult. Maybe they wouldn't have given him this 2-month window of bail that he needed to commit this heinous crime. But because too many opportunities were given to him along the way, it led to the tragic end of Priscilla, her 2 children, and her unborn child. After the murders, Daniel ran away from the Gustafson house through the woods back to his own house. In the search that would follow, it would later be found that Daniel ditched some of his clothes in the woods between the 2 homes, as some of his clothing was wet, seemingly from the bathtubs. The night that the crime happened, there were 2 people in town that the police suspected. One of them, of course, was Daniel. The police went to his house, asked him where he was, he gave some excuse, and then they left. It seemed that whoever the other suspect was, that guy had an alibi, so the police got a warrant to search Daniel's home. As the police approach Daniel's home, they see him jump out of the side of the house and make a run for it, which led to a statewide manhunt for 2 days. Daniel's face was all over the news, the newspapers, every cop in the state was looking for him. Someone recognized him in town and then called the police. When the police got there, he had just gotten away. At one point, he broke into someone's house and switched out his coat for their coat, I guess because he figured the person who saw him earlier probably saw what he was wearing, so he needed to change his outfit. Daniel had taken one of the 2 guns that he had previously stolen with him. So he uses this gun to hijack a woman driving a van. He gets in the car and holds her at gunpoint and makes her drive him to the next town over. At some point during this, the woman jumps out of the van and runs away. I guess Daniel didn't know how to drive a car, which would make sense considering he just took his bicycle everywhere. Or he figured that the police would be on the lookout for that van specifically because, you know, the woman who was driving it just ran away and is probably going to tell someone about it. So Daniel continues his run on foot. The police assumed that he was probably going to catch a train, so all train stations in the area were being monitored and searches conducted around them. Since assuming he can't get a car, a train is going to be his quickest means of escape. So on December the 4th, 2 days after Daniel had made his run for it, the police search a lumber yard located next to a train station. And while searching this lumber yard, sure enough, they found Daniel in an empty shack at the back of the property. This shack was like a worker's quarters for people who were working at the lumber yard. Funny enough, next to the shack was a big dumpster, which led a bunch of outlets to report that Daniel was found hiding in a trash can, which is more fitting, I think. So finally, on December the 4th, Daniel was arrested and the manhunt came to an end. Now, Daniel was caught dead to rights as anyone could be. All of the condoms from the Gustafsson house were filled with his DNA. The pornographic magazine pages that he had torn out and left at the Gustafsson house for some reason, the rest of the magazine was found back at his house. The wet clothes that were found in the woods connecting the 2 houses were later found to be Daniel's. The other pistol, the one he used to murder Priscilla, was found in the glove box of a car at his house. And quite poetically, one of the hairs of 8-year-old Abigail Gustafsson was found on his sock. A piece of the life he ended, making sure he wouldn't get to live out his. Also, you know, running from police and hijacking cars doesn't help. Because of this, his defense's strategy was to just argue technicality. For example, the original warrant that the police had signed on December the 2nd to come investigate Daniel before Daniel took off. In the warrant, the police had identified the house as a single-family residence, and the defense argued that it is a split-level home. And since Daniel was his own resident, or like almost an adult, I guess. So since the property was actually a 2-family home instead of a 1-family home, everything that came because of that warrant should be thrown out. The judge rightfully said, that's stupid, in more, legal appropriate words, noting that the house has one address and one primary entrance and everyone that lives there is related to each other, so single family's fine. After this, the argument the defense tried to go with is that none of the evidence points towards Daniel being the only perpetrator of the crime, and instead it could have been a group of people and Daniel is simply taking the fall for it, kind of implying that he was dragged along by this other group of mystery people and was actually just a witness to the crimes. You would think if this was the case, Daniel may say who did it, but whatever. And then also, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not an expert on this thing, but there was an argument made by the defense that said the nature of the crime indicates insanity, which is like a weird backup plan. Because they're like, look, the warrant was wrong. Nothing that came out of that warrant should be allowed. Okay, it is allowed. Well, how do we even know that Daniel was alone? It could have been like, a dozen people. Maybe he was just like outside and was watching. And also, hypothetically, if he were to do it, which I'm not saying, that would be the insanity defense, I think. Yeah. Despite this, Daniel was found guilty of all 3 murders at the Gustafsson home and sentenced to 3 life sentences in prison. Funny enough, this means that he never got tried for the original breaking and entering and attempted aggravated assault charges. And the comparatively minor stuff like holding the woman at gunpoint to steal her car or evading arrest. because again, he got 3 life sentences, so the rest doesn't really matter. And from there, Daniel has thankfully remained in prison. And it's pretty apparent that he's not happy about it. In 2012, the Supreme Court made some rulings to try to get parole opportunities for juvenile offenders who were sentenced to life sentences. And while Massachusetts followed suit with this, there was a clause that especially heinous crimes don't count. So when Daniel applied for early parole, he was immediately shut down, especially considering psychiatrists that have spoken to him since have said that he shows no remorse for the crime and should stay in there. He constantly files complaints against the justice system and against the prisons that he's being held in. For a while, he said that he was a Satanist and that the prison's not allowing him the things that he needs to perform his satanic rituals is a form of religious discrimination. At another point, he said he was trying to study law and the prison's not giving him enough time in the library was again discriminatory. Funny enough, for a while he got moved from Massachusetts to Colorado, I believe, because in Massachusetts he believed he was going to be murdered by the other inmates, which is likely considering child murderers are viewed pretty lowly in most prison populations. And Daniel will first be eligible for parole in 2033 when he is 62 years old. But according to everyone in power at the moment, that's not going to happen, and that guy is going to die in there. And with that, we have the end of the story of Daniel LaPlante, or the boy who lived in the walls. I mean, what's there to say about it? I always try to be careful when I cover topics like this, because at the end of the day, it was lives that were snuffed out, and regardless of the spectacular nature of the crime, I don't want it to lose the fact that this is a very evil person who did very evil things. According to Joe Turner, several women still write Daniel letters and claim to be his girlfriend who are obsessed with this serial killer bad boy who's locked up. So I don't mean any of this to romanticize or make a spectacle out of a tragic death. Instead, just to give a tale of how terrifying and strange the world can be. And while enjoyable may not be the right word, I hope you at least found some of this interesting. And I really appreciate it, and I just want to say thank you for watching. Talking to Joe Turner, there are so many things about this case that are so weird, so many like local legends and stories. There's one belief that Andrew Gustafsson actually paid Daniel to kill his family, and the only evidence of that is that he remarried 8 months later. Which, like, okay, that doesn't mean that he paid this kid to murder his family. Also, if that was the case, then don't you think Daniel would have said something about it? Like, why would Daniel, like, have this sudden loyalty to a guy who paid him to murder his whole family? Like, it's absurd. But there's, like, weird stories like that. According to Joe, about a year after Daniel was arrested, he attempted a breakout that almost worked.
Also, didn't really have an area to casually mention this, but the house Daniel LaPlante lived on was 22 Elm Street. So he was literally a nightmare from Elm Street.
But all of those are details he's saving for his book. So again, I'll link Joe Turner's website in the description. Be sure to follow him and check it out whenever the book and documentary comes out, because he is going to have a lot of stuff in there that I don't even know about, let alone covered. But he was incredibly kind to provide his information, as well as some of the images you've seen in this video. So it certainly does mean the world, and I really appreciate not only people who are cool enough to learn about these things and document them, but are cool enough to share that information with YouTubers, because it is much better than the alternative. I can tell you that. But no, thank you guys so much for watching. Again, we have the merch that's available for like a week, maybe not even that, maybe just a few more days. Get in on it while you can at wendigoon.shop, linked in the description. Some more content coming for you all on the second channel, Wendigang, very soon, so stay tuned for that. But I believe that should do it for now. But I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!
Alright, the stream is starting.
Oh my god, I'm not watching
going
this
wrong? My
motherfucker.
McAfee trial has expired, so I guess that's gone wrong, but no one needed that program anyways. We're playing the
You've likely heard it said that truth is stranger than fiction, and few cases make that as apparent as the tale of Daniel LaPlante. As bizarre as it sounds, a 17-year-old Daniel became obsessed with a girl he knew and hid in the wall of her home for 9 months, and would later go on to murder 3 people. The details of this entire case are nearly too shocking to be believed. Now, this story is so notorious within criminal history that it has become a sort of urban legend. Since the 1980s, it has been passed around. At 1:30 p.m. on August the 28th of 2003, a pizza delivery driver named Brian Wells would go out on what seemed to be a normal pizza delivery. 1 hour later, he would be standing in a PNC bank with a shotgun in his hand and a bomb strapped to his chest, demanding $250,000. The tragedy and mysteries that began to unfold that day have been described by federal agents as one of the most complicated and bizarre crimes in the annals of the FBI. Hello everybody, today we are going to be talking about FBI Major Case 203, the Bomb Collar Bank Heist. The events of the Bomb Collar Bank Heist are among the most bizarre in criminal history. Those of you that have heard of this case know how absolutely insane it is, and to those of you that haven't, you are in for it today. Now, to try to help us make sense of all of this, I for one have a whiteboard, but also cute little mugshots that I printed out of everyone involved to try to help us wrap our minds around all of this insanity. Now, over the course of this video, I'm going to be referencing journalists and news sites that originally covered this information, as opposed to my arts and crafts project. But the primary one I want to recommend is the Netflix miniseries Evil Genius, made by Barbara Schroeder and Trey Borzillieri, as they not only did a great job covering the events, but also went and interviewed people and got first-hand accounts and information that can be found nowhere else that we're going to talk about today. So if this case interests you, I highly recommend you check out the 4-episode miniseries on Netflix. And today, I'm going to try to go through and tell the story in the timeline that it was revealed to the public and investigators at large. So if you're familiar with this case and you're yelling at the screen at any point if I say something that was proven to be wrong later down the line, I'm laying out information in the order it was discovered, so don't worry, we'll get there. So if you're interested in hearing what turned out to be an overly complicated and cruel bank heist, then stick around as we talk about the Bomb Collar bank robbery. And it's just gonna be really sad and depressing. It'll be funny in some parts, but mostly just sad and depressing. So if you're interested in that, you've come to the right place. But before I talk about something that will definitely be bad for your brain, let's talk about something that will definitely be good for your body. Like today's sponsor, Athletic Greens. And specifically, their fantastic product, the dietary supplement to help you start your day on the right foot, AG1. Y'all like the whiteboard with the logos and stuff on it? I think it's cute. AG1 is a full-body dietary supplement that helps support things like your immune system, digestion, and energy without being 100 different pills that you have to take every morning, and is instead just one drink. AG1 is full of things like probiotics to support your gut health, as well as several ingredients to aid in digestion. But it's also full of things like natural form B12 and biotin to increase your daily energy, and things like zinc and citrate to help support your immune system. AG1 is pretty much what should be your daily dose of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and probiotics, all wrapped into one drink. And it's okay, bros, there's no shame in it. As someone who spends all day behind a computer putting together videos, my diet consists primarily of ramen, pizza, and more ramen. But on top of that, I'm also really lazy, which means I don't want to keep track of all the multivitamins and oils and supplements that I'm supposed to take every day, so in other words, I should be dead. But thanks to Athletic Greens, I don't have to micromanage how many pills or drinks I'm taking every morning, because with AG1, it's just one easy step. Your AG1 will come in a bag like this, or you can do what I did and put it in this very aesthetic thermos to help with storage and refrigeration. So all that you have to do for AG1 is get 8 to 12 ounces of cold water, and from there just take a scoop of your AG1, dump it into the water, shake it up, and that's all it takes to start your day off right. And I know what you're asking. You're asking the same thing I am. You're looking at this bottle of green and saying that has to taste terrible. And that's the surprising part. See, I'm used to trying dietary supplements and it just tastes like grass, but with AG1, it tastes just fine. There's not a really strong flavor whenever you drink it. Again, the primary thing inside of this is water. And what aftertaste it does have is just kind of sweet. not in like a sugary way, but kind of in like a vanilla way, in like a natural sweet way. I tried it and thought it was vanilla. My mom tried it and said it was kind of like a cinnamon, but it's just a pleasant drink that you can have in the morning to start your day off right, without feeling like you just licked the front lawn. AG1 is effectively 9 different health products working together as one, and it's an entire comprehensive diet made simple. And if you're wanting to start your day off right, then now's the perfect time to do it. Because if you go to the link in the description and get in on AG1 now, then with your purchase, you will receive these 2 free gifts. One is 5 of the AG1 travel packs. This is the exact same thing that you get in the large tub that you scoop out of. These are just individually wrapped travel packs so that you can bring them on the go. And the other is a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2. All you gotta do is take a drop of this stuff once a day to get your daily intake of those vitamins. Meaning again, it makes your diet much more easy to manage, and since it's only a drop a day, this is a year's supply. So again, if you get in on AG1, you will get 5 extra days of AG1 and a year's worth of vitamin D3 and K2 for free. Because since your health is so important, it shouldn't be complicated. And now, it doesn't have to be. Again, go to the link in the description to get in on AG1 today. Thank you all so much for watching the ad, and thank you to Athletic Greens for sponsoring this video. It really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. Link is in the description, and we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Once we have context for everything, we're going to go back and look at the events that led up to the robbery that day. But for now, I think there's no better place to start than with the events of August the 28th. Hey everyone, this is Mini Wendigoon. This is a really big case with a lot of moving parts, so there's some stuff I forgot to include on the initial recording. So whenever you see this little dude, it's me speaking through his corporeal form to give you information I forgot earlier. The first thing I want to mention is I will be using some diagrams and images from pizzabomber.com. It's a fantastic website of people who have done a great job at compiling stories and evidence photos from the case itself. So if you see any of the diagrams in this video that seem helpful, I encourage you to check them out. They'll be linked in the description. And thank you pizzabomber.com for the work you're doing. On August the 28th of 2003, a 46-year-old pizza delivery driver named Brian Wells was working his normal shift at the Mamma Mia's Pizzeria in Erie, Pennsylvania. Everything was going normal until around 1:30 p.m. The owner of the pizzeria received a delivery call. The owner couldn't understand what the guy on the other end of the line was saying, so he passed the phone to Brian. Brian says that the call was for 2 sausage pizzas to be delivered to 8631 Peachtree. Brian drives to the location that turns out to be an abandoned radio station. It also turns out that after future investigation, the original phone call was made from a nearby gas station. Brian goes to deliver the pizzas, and all seems normal for now, until nearly an hour had passed by and Brian hadn't come back to work. What might have happened to Brian in that hour of lost time will be discussed later, but what matters now is what happened at 2:30. At around 2:30 p.m., Brian walked into a local PNC bank. He was holding a cane and wearing a t-shirt that had "Guess" written across it. Underneath the t-shirt, something was lying on his chest. When Brian gets to the counter, he slides a note to the teller demanding $250,000. He also reveals that the cane that he's holding is a shotgun in disguise, and that underneath his shirt is a large bomb collar. Somehow, in that hour of time between delivering the pizza and showing up here at the bank, Brian had a bomb strapped to his chest with what seemed to be a giant metal handcuff wrapped around his neck to keep it in place. The note that he slid the teller was ridiculously long, and I'm not going to read all of it for sake of time, but as you can see here, this is way more information than is needed to just say, "Give me $250,000. The teller says that the vault cannot be open at this time, and the best she can do is give him all the money they have in the register. So Bryant walked out with $8,702. During this time, other tellers were trying to usher people out of the bank, and a few people began to call the police. From here, Bryant drove to a McDonald's parking lot, I'll explain why later, and then from there, about 15 minutes after the robbery took place, police pull him over in the parking lot of Eyeglass World, just as Bryant was trying to leave the McDonald's. Police get Bryant out of the car, arrest him, but as they're arresting him, he mentions something about a bomb. The officers look under his shirt, and sure enough, he has a bomb collar strapped to his neck. The police immediately clear the street and begin to evacuate the nearby buildings and roads so that no one gets hurt. The initial stop was made around 2:54 and the bomb squad was called at around 3:04. But there was a problem with the bomb squad getting there. See, in order to make sure that no one would be harmed if the bomb did go off, they began to evacuate and clear the main road that led to the Eyeglass World parking lot. What that meant is further down every street, there was a lot of congestion. So the bomb squad truck that would normally be able to get there just fine now had to contend with traffic. The police keep their guns aimed on Brian. They have no idea if this guy has strapped a bomb to himself in order to rob the bank, if someone else has done that to him, so they begin to ask him questions.
I get kicked for being
Brian
AFK.
says is that 3 black men held him down and strapped the bomb to his neck. When asked to further identify these men, he couldn't and simply said that they were 3 black guys. In the midst of this, Brian seems to be making nonsensical requests, like he asks the police to call his boss so that his boss doesn't think he's slacking off work. He also begins to tell the police that maybe if they can take the notes and continue on to the next steps, that they can get the key to let him free. Again, the police have no idea what Brian's talking about, but Brian continues to say maybe they can follow the steps. By this time, local news crews had shown up and were recording the entire ordeal from several different angles. As the police and Brian are talking, the collar on Brian's neck begins to beep. When it does, Brian seems to sort of panic. His voice gets more exacerbated, and he keeps asking the police to come get it off of him and saying that he's not lying, it's gonna blow. As the beeping gets faster and faster, Brian begins to try to physically scoot away from the bomb that is strapped to his chest, seemingly trying to get away from the explosion. The tension continues to build until at 3:18, the bomb explodes. The back wall of the metal device that was hanging in front of Brian's chest had a metal plate that seemed to be cut in segregated pieces to cause fragmentation. The back plate didn't work quite like that, but what it did do is blow the piece of metal inward that punched about a fist-sized hole through Brian's chest. Brian died in seconds, and the entire ordeal was recorded by the news cameras. Now, due to a broadcasting malfunction, Brian's death wasn't shown live on the air, but the footage still existed and managed to find its way online. The bomb squad finally arrived 3 minutes after Brian's death. As they began to clear his car and search through the evidence, they found 9 pages of handwritten notes in Brian's vehicle. The notes contained a series of instructions for Brian, the receptionist at the bank manager, and the police. Brian being referred to as bomb hostage within the notes. The notes given to Brian featured a series of rules for him on the first page. The rules are as follows. Number 1, you must follow a course of instructions to find keys and combination codes to disarm bomb. Do not insert keys into keyholes until instructed. Some keyholes are booby-trapped to prevent tampering. Number 2, drive 60 miles an hour throughout course. Number 3, use only 2 or 3 minutes at each stop. A sentry will be watching at each stop to ensure you are not being followed. Number 4, bomb has tripwires. Forcing or tampering will detonate. Number 5, all weapons, papers, containers, tapes, etc. must be returned to us. Each item you find after dropping money has a key and or combination word. You will need to decipher the combination. This will disarm some tripwires before you unlock. This procedure is to make sure you leave no materials behind. And upon reading the notes, it seems that Brian was sent on a life or death scavenger hunt. The notes he was given gave him very specific instructions of what to do following the bank robbery. After robbing the bank, Brian was to drive in and around Erie finding different combinations and keys to stop the bomb on his chest from blowing up. I really cannot stress how much this whole thing is like a saw trap. He seemingly was placed in a collar and given a series of directions with a timer of 55 minutes to complete everything, or else the bomb would detonate. So the first thing the police do is keep following the trail. It seemed that along each stop there would be another note to give Brian more directions on where to go next. It seems that after robbing the bank, the next step was go to the nearby McDonald's. At that McDonald's, next to the McDonald's sign, there was a rock, and underneath that rock was a jar containing Brian's next steps. Brian had made it that far. As mentioned earlier, police saw him as he was leaving the McDonald's, and it seems that when the police stopped him, he was going on to the next objective. That next objective was located in the woods just outside of town. It's also mentioned in the note that there were a series of sentries who would be driving around town making sure Brian was doing everything he was supposed to. And the first thing he was supposed to do after leaving McDonald's was tie an orange ribbon around a fire hydrant as a signal that the bank had been successfully robbed. It seems that the police stopped him right as he was about to tie the ribbon. So the police follow these notes to the location mentioned in the woods, and when they get there, sure enough, they find an orange ribbon and a jar that contains the next set of directions. While they were searching that location, Officer Lamont King says that he saw a blue van pull up in the tree line, see the police officers that were searching the area where the jar was located before the van stopped, backed up, and drove away. Keep that blue van in mind for later. The note they found in the woods told them to drive to a road sign a few miles away, get out at the road sign, and walk through the grass into a field. When the police got to that next location, they found the jar, but nothing was in it. Meaning that either whoever was watching this go down, perhaps the sentries and the person in the blue van as mentioned earlier, had seen the police were meddling with everything, so they went to the jar and took out the next set of directions before the police could get there, or Bryant was never intended to make it that far. So with that, the police couldn't keep chasing the trail of breadcrumbs and had to begin their investigation as per usual. As you can imagine, this was a huge deal in Erie at the time. This small town had been hit by what was seemingly this masterminded heist with a guy with a explosive collar strapped to his neck who was supposed to carry it all out. There was a lot of pressure to get this case solved, so the police began to work fast. Hey, so we're going to do the rest of this over here. Sitting in that chair and turning like that over and over made me feel like Santa Claus, so we're just going to stand. The first thing the police did was search Brian's home, and they didn't find much. The one thing they did find was the number of a local prostitute named Jessica Hoopsick. It seems that Brian knew Hoopsick and would regularly call her to turn tricks. I wonder if YouTube's demonetization's caught on to that one yet. We'll find out. But the only thing that proves is that he was okay with very brief steps outside of the law. That is still a far cry from a bomb collar bank robbery. So while the police are investigating this and trying to go through Brian's history to see if he had known anyone who would be capable of something like this, or if anyone in Brian's past would indicate that he'd ever do something like this, something weird happens. On August the 31st, only 3 days after the bank robbery and Brian's death, the only other pizza delivery driver at Mamma Mia's Pizzeria, a man by the name of Robert Panetti, who was the co-worker of Brian, dies. He died in his home of what appears to be a drug overdose. Now, Robert did have a history of drug abuse in the past, so it's not out of completely left field that he would die of an OD. But what was suspicious about this to investigators is originally they had went to the pizzeria to interview Robert on that Saturday. Brian died on Thursday the 28th, and Robert was approached to be interviewed 2 days later on Saturday the 30th. But Robert said, well, I'm working a shift today. I don't really want to do the interview. Can we put the interview off till Monday? And the investigator said yes, but the night before he's supposed to be interviewed on August 31st, he overdoses. So, as you could imagine, this wasn't open and shut for investigators, and the door was left open that he might have some connection to everything that's going on. And they figured that even if it was an overdose, maybe the stress of being interrogated by police, if he had something to do with the bank heist, was too much for him, so he just kept taking drugs and eventually died. In the meantime, police are looking for Jessica Hoopsick and can't seem to find her. The only other lead that they follow during this time is there was a woman who was a previous girlfriend, I believe, of Brian's, who was now dating a black guy who, the reports vary. Some say he was a welder, others say he was a mechanic, some kind of person who was good with toolcraft, who could theoretically make the collar bomb. And if you'll remember, the only thing Brian gave them to go off of before he died was that 3 black men threw the collar on him. So the cops in Erie, Pennsylvania are like, all right, I guess we'll just look for black people. But as you can imagine, that didn't go anywhere. The 2 other points they had to go off of was the radio tower and the bomb itself. At the radio tower, the forensics team took a pretty good record of what went down going off of the dirt road and path in front of the radio tower itself. So they could see from the dirt that Brian's car drove up. There were several people standing out front of the radio tower, and as indicated by the dirt, there was a sort of scuffle where it seems a couple people fell over before Brian's car drives away. Assumedly, it was at the radio tower that this bomb collar would have been put onto him. So the question is, what went down at 8631 Peach Street? It seems that there was some kind of a fight in the dirt, but other than that, they didn't have a lot to go on. The other lead was the bomb itself, which was weird to say the least. The inner machinations of the bomb itself weren't that complicated. It was just 2 pipe bombs laid in front of Brian's chest that were filled with smokeless powder. It's pretty much the most elementary bomb you could make. The actual locking mechanism around the neck was effectively a giant handcuff, with the same system of ratchets that click into place, and a key that's needed to release the ratchet so that it can come undone. Now, while that was the basic construction of the bomb, it had several other complications. Like, while one key could be used to undo the whole thing, the bomb itself had 4 keyholes and a 3-digit combination lock. On top of that, the inside of the case holding the bomb had 2 kitchen timers that were seemingly used for the countdown that would start the explosion sequence indicated by the beeping noise. But there were also a lot of really weird implements on the bomb as well. Like, for example, there was a fake cell phone that was put into it, seemingly just to throw people off, as well as several wires that didn't go anywhere. On top of that, there were several warnings written on the collar itself that said things like, if you cut the wrong wire, it will cause an early detonation. If you try to remove it this way, that will cause a detonation. And seemed to be a way of giving red herrings to whatever police officer would try to remove the device. It was an otherwise simple mechanism that was made overly complicated to throw off investigators. Kind of like this entire case. Another point to mention is that in order to keep the bomb collar intact during the investigation, the police decided to remove Brian's head during his autopsy. As you could imagine, this decision was highly contested by the family, but since the bomb collar was the only thing the police had to work with, they decided that keeping it intact was paramount. See,
I really just lost all that shit. You gotta be fucking with me.
You
really gotta be fucking with
just
me.
in it for the money. There's easier ways to steal $250,000. They're partially in it for the game of it all. Because think about it, supposedly just kidnapping a random guy,
this might be it. I gotta get in. I gotta get in.
And then doing things like the fake instructions or the ridiculously long series of notes to give to the bank teller and the entire scavenger hunt of the crime itself. It seems that whatever was going on here was more than just a bank robbery. However, it would get far more complicated than anyone expected very soon. On September the 20th, 3 weeks after Brian's death, the Erie police receive a phone call. The phone call is from a man named Bill Rothstein, who says he has a dead body in his freezer. Bill says that the body is of a man named James Roden. However, Bill says that he did not kill James Roden, and that the killer was a woman named Marjorie Deal Armstrong. Marjorie is one of the most important players in this entire case, and for good reason. See, Marjorie had a history of legal trouble in Erie, Pennsylvania. In 1984, she was the focus of the most famous murder case in Erie's history, up until this murder case. In 1984, Marjorie murdered her boyfriend by shooting him in the chest 6 times while he was asleep on the couch. It was a whole legal trial because Marjorie said that she was being abused by this boyfriend, and that the reason she killed him while he was asleep is because she felt it was the only time she'd be safe from him. And after a very messy and public trial, Marjorie was released. 8 years later, in 1992, Marjorie's at the time husband came to the hospital for a brain hemorrhage. He was unresponsive, but according to Marjorie, he had hit his head falling into the coffee table. Her husband died while at the hospital, and Marjorie sued the hospital for malpractice and won. However, given her past history of shooting the guy to death, as well as her current endeavors, several people think maybe her husband didn't die from just falling into the coffee table. There was also apparently a boyfriend somewhere in there who she dated for a while, who took his own life, so she has a history of men dying in her presence. So back in this timeline, Bill calls the police and says that Marjorie murdered James Roden and the body is now stuffed in Bill's freezer. Bill says that Marjorie had murdered James over a money dispute and had Bill get rid of the gun. Bill, being afraid of Marjorie and knowing how manipulative she can be, decided to help her get rid of the evidence and store the body. However, it was after Marjorie asked him to grind up the body of James Roden that Bill couldn't do it and decided to call the police. So why does any of this relate to our Brian Wells case? What does any of this have to do with a bank heist on August the 28th? Well, the address that Bill lived at, where James Roden's body was located, was 8645 Peach Street, effectively the front yard of the abandoned radio tower. Whenever Bill calls the police, he tells them to arrest Marjorie, who is currently living at Bill's house. So the police go to get the body, they arrest Marjorie, and they go through both of their houses, and both of them were compulsive hoarders. Not only did they have clutter and just various things to such a degree that the police weren't able to find the floor as they were walking through the house, but Marjorie here also had 400 pounds of butter and 700 pounds of cheese, all of which were completely rotted. The officers who arrested Marjorie said that the most distinct memory of the entire event was A, how loud she was, and B, how stinky she was. The entire house was covered in dog poop and rotten food, and she smelled like both of those things. And before you're like, wow, Wendigoon, that's really mean to make fun of someone who's in poverty. For one, Marjorie was not in poverty, because if you'll remember, she won a ton of money from her dead husband's malpractice suit. The specific amount seems to be private, but she bought a ton of expensive things and continuously told people that she was rich. And two, Marjorie is really, really annoying. She would never stop talking, she would constantly yell and berate people around her, even people who were trying to help her, like reporters and her own attorney. A few doctors diagnosed her with things like bipolar disorder, but other doctors just said she had a narcissistic personality disorder. The FBI agents who would interrogate her over the coming months said that anytime they would go to talk to her, she would just yell expletives at them, tell them to kill themselves, that she hated them, and then one of them would compliment her, be like, your hair looks lovely today, and she just stopped immediately. In that 1984 case, whenever she murdered her boyfriend, her own defense attorney said that she should have never went to trial, because if she goes to trial, she can get off for some level of mental incompetency or being battered or what have you, and said that she should instead be put into an institution where she can be locked away forever. She is dangerous and smart, and that if she is allowed to go free, this will happen again. Which, if your own attorney's saying that, that's pretty bad. So Bill Rothstein calls the police, says that there's a dead body in his freezer, that Marjorie did it. The police already know who Marjorie is, so they go to arrest her, and they get James's body out and begin sifting through the house. Right after Bill made that phone call, he apparently attempted to take his own life. A lot of sources say that he only wrote the note and then never made any physical attempts to do it. But in the Netflix documentary, there's a scene where the police are walking through his house and ask what the bag of blood with a razor blade in it is, and he says that that's his. And this point's never refuted, so I imagine the police tested it and it turns out that that was his blood. So it seems there was some kind of physical attempt made. Bill hurriedly wrote a note after he called the police, assuming that he would have finished the deed by the time the police got there. In the note, he says, "The body in the freezer in the garage is Jim Roden. I did not kill him nor participate in his death. My apologies to those who cared for or about me. I am sorry that I let them down. I am sorry to leave you this mess, Bill Rothstein." However, the most interesting part is what he wrote at the beginning of this note that says, "This has nothing to do with the Wells case." Okay, so picture this. You're an investigator. You get a call that there is a dead body at this location directly in the front yard of the radio tower, right where the big mystery location of the bomb collar bank robbery. And officially, there's no connection because James Roden, come to find out in the autopsy, was killed 3 weeks before the day Brian Wells was killed. So seemingly, it's an unrelated incident. I mean, obviously they're going to investigate it, but the hard evidence is that it's just coincidence the two were located so close to each other. And then the guy who assisted in moving the body of James Roden writes in his note, this has nothing to do with Brian Wells. So at this point, the FBI has 3 bodies that seemingly have no relation to each other, except for the guy who said that one of them is definitely not related, so definitely don't look into it, and whenever he's asked about it, he says he has no idea what they're talking about. I can't profess to know exactly how the FBI was feeling at the time, but if I had to guess, it was probably something like... Because it seems like while they've been investigating for the past month, these wheels have been turning in the background that there's been no evidence of for them to stop before it's too late. But now it seems that their best leads are Bill Rothstein and Marjorie Deal Armstrong. So right now, let's talk about Bill Rothstein. Bill Rothstein, like Marjorie, was also a very annoying person, but for a different reason. Bill was the kind of guy who always felt like he was the smartest person in the room. He would constantly use needlessly complicated words and always talk down to people who he felt weren't as educated as he was. In a lot of the interview segments I've seen with him, he would randomly switch into speaking French or Hebrew and then be like, oh, you don't speak French? Okay, well, I guess I'll speak English for the commoners. He was the kind of guy who always wanted to prove how smart he was. Bill also had a lot of technical know-how. He was fluent with several different kinds of machinery and metalwork, and according to those around him, he was a very gifted guy who never really followed through on anything. He was going to be a pilot for a while, but then he decided he wasn't interested. He was going to be a professor, then decided he wasn't interested, which eventually led to the situation of him living in a derelict biohazard of a home while telling people around him that he's smarter than them because he can speak Hebrew. The way that Bill knew Marjorie is that the two of them were lovers, at least for a time. Several years back, Bill and Marjorie dated, and according to some reports, were even engaged for a time. However, the two broke up on bitter terms, but according to everyone who knew these two, Bill could never get over Marjorie. So anytime she had trouble or wanted something from him, he was at her beck and call. It's also important to point out that both of them were smart. I know that I've mentioned they had physical smarts, like she was conniving and he was fluent in things like French and Hebrew, but they both seemed to be clever as well. Marjorie had a master's degree, and Bill had apparently taken all kinds of college classes and led a group called the Fractured Intellectuals, which was, I imagine, a group of people who thought they were too smart for everyone else. I mean, he called his group the Fractured Intellectuals, like, okay. And it seems that a lot of the troubles with the investigation came from investigators underestimating these two. So anyway, Bill is now in interrogation for the phone call he made that's got Marjorie arrested and led to the body of James Roden. Bill is completely open with everything. He explains that Marjorie had hated James Roden for a long time. They were a very on-again, off-again relationship where they would be very passionate and in love one minute and then wanting to kill each other the next. Bill said one night, in a fit of rage, after they had an argument over money, Marjorie loaded a shotgun and shot James in the back. Bill came over to help her, and after she gave him $2,000, he took the body to put in his freezer and then used a torch to melt down the shotgun. And as mentioned earlier, he was content on keeping it into the future, but whenever she asked him to grind up the body, he said he wouldn't do it. And once again, it was determined that James Roden was killed 3 weeks before Brian Wells. So seemingly, the two deaths were unconnected, other than the fact that it just so happened the body was hidden very close to the radio station. During this time, the only other person that the police were able to loop in to their investigation was an old roommate of Bill Rothstein's named Floyd Stockton. Floyd Stockton had lived with Rothstein supposedly at the time of James Roden's death and was currently in hiding for having physical relations with a 14-year-old girl, so real stand-up kind of guy. Eventually, the police find Floyd, and he backs up everything that Bill says about the James Roden case, but says he has no information about Brian Wells. So I want you to think for a second. There is currently a woman who has a history of murder. Again, she got off on him, but she has at least definitely killed 2 people at this point, Roden and her first boyfriend, justified or not. And then she has a lover, or on-again, off-again lover, who lives in the front yard of the location where Brian Wells was kidnapped, and he has an affinity for building metal contraptions and making things needlessly elaborate and trying to prove how smart he is. And they're trying to figure out who in that radio station, at that abandoned radio station, would put together a scenario where a man gets a bomb strapped to his chest and is told to follow a scavenger hunt. And they've got these two literally in the front yard. And what does the FBI do? After talking to Stockton, they remove Rothstein from the Brian Wells investigation. He's still having his whole investigation with James Roden, but they said, no, this guy looks totally clear of Brian Wells, even though he lives in the front yard of where the whole Wells situation went down. And when he wrote a suicide note, the first thing he said is, this has nothing to do with Brian Wells, so don't ask about it. I'm convinced that, like, police television shows, like, you know, serial dramas, like Law & Order, Criminal Minds, those have to be funded by the State Department. Like, we know the Department of Defense funds games like Call of Duty because it's like propaganda, right? And like Homeland Security or the FBI or someone's got to be funding those TV shows, because those shows are always like a cop sees a strand of hair and they're like, this clearly relates back to the cold case I read about in 1972 during my day off. When in real life, every single case I read about, the cops are like, after 8 months, they eventually searched the skeleton pile only to find that it was full of skeletons. So, after the police cleared Rothstein, Marjorie finds out about it, and she's not happy one bit. Also, if during the whole time of me mentioning them being on-again, off-again lovers, let me just clarify that publicly, they absolutely despised each other. If they did have a relationship, it was one built on hate, because they were constantly saying things to try to get the other one locked up. So, while Rothstein gets cleared of suspicion on the Wells case, while Marjorie is being moved through prison and the press are all over her with cameras, she looks at them and yells, Bill Rothstein is responsible for Brian Wells' death. So that opens the door back up. Okay, well, the person that we think killed Wells is now saying Rothstein killed Wells. So even though Rothstein wasn't the Fed's primary guy at the moment, people began to ask him questions, and over again, Rothstein said no, he has nothing to do with the Brian Wells case. Also during this time, Bill had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and his condition was slowly getting worse, and eventually in 2004, he ends up in a hospital. In July, during his last month of life, feds would continue to go to his bedside and say, look, you're almost dead, you're definitely not going to go to trial at this rate, you'll be dead before anything happens. Why don't you just tell us, did you have anything to do with Brian Wells? And one agent said that after he asked him that question, Bill, laying on the bed, not even looking at him, sarcastically drew a big no with his finger. And up until Bill Rothstein's death on July the 30th of 2004, he denied any association with the Brian Wells case. So Bill is now dead. I could draw X's there. Oh, I could do the thing that they do in yeah, look at that. Oh, I've always wanted to do that, like the old CIA pictures and stuff, bulletin boards, like the target's dead or whatever. I'm gonna put the X over the eye. That's cool. I like that. Like I said, YouTube's just a glorified daycare. I guess I draw an X over their eyes too, since they're dead. Do I draw an X over their eye? Feels kind of rude. I'll draw a red X over their eye. That feels less harsh. Y'all probably can't even see that, but yeah, red X's just to symbolize their death. So shortly after Bill's death, probably realizing there wasn't a lot of ways for this to play out, they pretty much had her dead to rights, Marjorie confessed to the death of James Roden. Specifically, she confessed to third-degree murder, but mentally ill, which means she was sentenced to 7 to 20 years in a mental institution. Again, I'm going to mention that you should definitely watch the Netflix documentary, because it's around this time that the creator of the documentary began to go to Erie, Pennsylvania, and make contact with these people directly. As a matter of fact, he tried to speak to Bill Rothstein shortly before his death, but Rothstein denied him. I mention that because it's during this time that the documentary maker begins to talk to Marjorie Deal, who is just willing to talk to anyone about anything relating to herself. So as soon as Bill's out of the picture, she immediately begins saying to both the documentary crew and the police that Rothstein was responsible for Brian Wells' death. And then from there, during her sentencing, it seems Marjorie just couldn't help but talk all about the Wells case. See, initially she was quiet about it and didn't bring it up. She implicated a friend of hers, Ken Barnes, on an old cold case, and whenever she saw that the police weren't interested in that, she was like, well, actually, I know a lot about the Wells case, so the feds started to listen. It seems that Marjorie wanted transferred to a different facility because she would apparently call her attorney and the news up to twice an hour just to babble on and on about the case. So at some point, her lawyer said something like, oh, I don't want to, drive all the way to the facility you're at. I can't do that every day. So she is trying to give information to the feds so that she can be closer to her attorney, so her attorney would have to come see her more. So she starts talking about the Wells case and says all kinds of crazy stuff. For one, she mentions to investigators that Rothstein had her buy 2 kitchen timers to be used in the explosive. This was a big deal because the fact that there were 2 kitchen timers wasn't made public knowledge, so it would be something that only the people who were a part of the case would be privy to. She also mentioned that it was weird how Rothstein had a blue van that he hid after Wells' death that he only began to use again after he was cleared of Wells' death. And if you'll remember, a blue fan is what Lamont King saw out in the tree line the day of the bank heist whenever they went to the woods to find a clue and he saw a van out in the distance, meaning it's quite possible that that was Bill Rothstein's van. Also, during this time, they found a letter from Marjorie that indicated she was furious at PNC Bank, the same one Brian Wells robbed, because she thought that they were letting her father dip into her savings account, which wasn't true. It was his money to begin with, but she was still mad at PNC. So as feds would gently pressure her about things like this, like, hey, weren't you mad at the bank that the robbery took place at? She just keeps saying more stuff. She starts to talk about how Rothstein was coordinating it. She says that Stockton, Rothstein's old roommate, was in on it. Also, in the meantime, this case keeps making the rounds through news sources and television shows. I think it was on America's Most Wanted like 3 times. And as they would keep telling this story over and over again in the press, new information would come out. Like, for example, remember how at the beginning of the story I said that the phone call that ordered the 2 pizzas that kicked all of this off was made from a payphone at a local gas station? Well, that's where the call was traced back to, but initially there were no eyewitnesses of who made the call. That is, until a guy in Erie was watching America's Most Wanted and saw the picture of Bill Rothstein and Marjorie Deal and said that those were the 2 people he saw at the payphone the morning of August the 28th. Meaning that's an eyewitness saying that Rothstein and Deal kicked the heist off. On top of that, another witness who was driving down the highway through Erie the day of August the 28th says that he saw Marjorie in a car driving on the median in the opposite direction up the highway going like 70 miles an hour and said that she had a very distinct and abnormal face that he immediately recognized whenever he saw it on television. So that is 2 people who place Marjorie as the one, along with Rothstein, who kicked off the entire event by telling Wells to come out to the radio tower, and someone who saw her speeding down the highway in the wrong direction at the time everything was going down. And what was funny is the feds would go to Marjorie with this, because, you can't convict someone for murder or bank robbery off of one eyewitness, right? So they would go to Marjorie and be like, Marjorie, this information's not looking good. And Marjorie would be like, well, if you get me immunity, I'll tell you everything I know. And they'd be like, oh yeah, what do you know? And she'd be like, well, I know that on the day of August 28th, and she would just give them information. Like she couldn't quit talking because she was so full of herself, so she would just talk all of her information out the window. Eventually, the feds asked if she would do a ride-along with them to show them where she was at the day of August 28th, the day of the heist. So she gets in the back of the car and drives them to every location she was at that day, which was always immediately next to Brian Wells. It was next to the bank, next to the McDonald's, next to Eyeglass World. And I guess she was saying all that in case someone had spotted her at any of these locations, but her story was that she was just conveniently shopping like 100 feet from Brian throughout the day, and also didn't know anything about the event, despite the roads being shut down, despite a bomb going off in the middle of town. Said she didn't see or hear anything until she went home that night and saw it on the news. So she gets into the car with the feds, tells them all of that, and then when they get back to jail, she goes, "But I won't tell you anymore without immunity." Like, do you even understand what a negotiation is or immunity? Like, I hyped her up a little bit, saying like, oh, she's smart, she had a master's degree and all that, but she is not smart when it would sacrifice bragging. Also during this time, the feds were building a case against her, even though she was doing a pretty good job of that herself, but they were building a case against her with information that had been taken from the past several years. For example, whenever she was in prison awaiting the trial for James Roden, there were several other women in the prison who began to literally take notes on the things she would say. Among these was a woman named Kelly McKellar, who anytime Marjorie would say something relating to either Roden or the Wells case, would write it down. Among those, she said things like Stockton being involved as one of the conspirators, and quote, "It's not like we didn't measure his neck for the collar." I should also mention that the reason these notes took so long to come forward as evidence and be made known to investigators is because the police department took the notes and filed them away in a desk inside of an envelope labeled snitch notes, and seemingly just forgot about them until years later. So yeah, see my skeleton pile joke from earlier. So while the feds are building their case, there's another character in this story who they've been keeping an eye on, who I should mention now. That man is named Ken Barnes. Ken Barnes was a local drug dealer who knew Stockton, Rothstein, and Deal personally. As a matter of fact, Barnes and his girlfriend would often go out fishing with Deal and Roden. During the Roden investigation, Barnes was very complicit with the police and would tell them about how Deal and Roden would get into fights all the time, and he's not surprised that Deal would eventually kill him. Also, if you'll remember, whenever Marjorie was trying to get her sentence reduced or some kind of immunity, she was trying to out Ken Barnes for an old cold case. So,
oh my god, why is this not working,
In 2005, while Barnes was in jail for completely unrelated drug charges, he was talking to his brother-in-law and said something about him being involved with the Wells case. So Barnes' brother-in-law went to the police and said, "Hey, I think my brother-in-law has something to do with the bomb collar bank heist." So the police began to interrogate him, and Barnes starts to say vague things about Marjorie's involvement. After Marjorie gets wind of this, she changes her story and says it wasn't actually Rothstein who was the mastermind of this whole thing. It was Rothstein and Barnes who were the mastermind of this whole thing, and she's of course innocent. And this kind of goes back and forth for a while, with Barnes saying stuff about Marjorie's involvement and Marjorie saying stuff about Barnes' involvement, until eventually Barnes realizes that eventually Marjorie's going to take some kind of plea deal and he's going to be out of luck, so he decides to get ahead of the curve. So on December the 9th of 2005, Ken Barnes gives a full confession. Ken says that the entire purpose for this bank heist was Marjorie Deal wanted her dad dead. Marjorie's mother had died years before, and Marjorie's father was at one time a very wealthy man. As he got older, he began to give more and more of his money to people in the community and local churches. Marjorie didn't like this, thinking that her father was giving away her inheritance. Which, funny side note, the father was asked and said that his daughter was never in his inheritance because he knew that she was crazy and would probably try to kill him. But nevertheless, Marjorie thought that if she could kill her father, then she'll get his money faster and, before he donates it. So she asked Ken Barnes how much it would cost for him to kill her father. Now, Ken says that he would, of course, never have done this, but he was just seeing if she'd be dumb enough to give him some of the money up front. I don't believe him at all, because there's no way they went through the stages of planning a whole heist over a joke, because he definitely wouldn't murder her father. He was so going to kill her father. But Ken says he would be willing to murder her father for $250,000. So the four of these people decide to plan a heist that they will be completely physically removed from. Ken says that the day before August the 28th, on August the 27th, there was a meeting to discuss the events of the heist that would be played out the next day. Ken says the people at that meeting were Floyd Stockton, Bill Rothstein, Marjorie Deal, Robert Panetti, and Brian Wells. According to Ken Barnes, Brian Wells was a part of the conspiracy that would end up killing him. This was an immediate shock to everyone. Other than maybe the idea that he got in with the wrong crowd, no one thought that Brian was a part of his own murder. On top of that, Barnes says whenever they originally came up with the idea of the heist, James Roden was supposed to be the driver. But Barnes hadn't seen him for a few weeks before all of this went down, which is why he wasn't at this meeting. So seemingly that connects the Roden case to all of this, because it seems that Marjorie killed him, perhaps because he wasn't going to go along with it or was going to tell somebody. At the very least, it seems Roden knew about the bank heist. And according to an eyewitness who apparently saw Brian Wells with this group of people on August the 27th, and the confession that Stockton would later give after giving a plea deal, all three say that Brian Wells was a part of the conspiracy. Specifically, according to Barnes, he thought that he was going to go in with a fake explosive. And that fake explosive was just a means of innocence if the plan doesn't work out. Because theoretically, if the cops stop him and they open the bomb case and see that there was never an explosive, but that Brian thought his life was on the line, then they're not going to thank him as one of the perpetrators. So according to Barnes, Brian was a part of it up until the bomb was real. According to Barnes, this was the events of August the 28th. Barnes says that he was picked up by Marjorie that morning to get ready for the heist. Everyone set up at the radio tower, and then Marjorie and Bill went to order the pizza. Whenever Brian got there with the pizza, he was standing there in front of Ken, Floyd, Bill, and Marjorie. As they're standing there, Stockton brings out the bomb collar from inside of the radio tower. Wells, realizing that something was wrong, or perhaps realizing then that the bomb was real, tries to get away. As he does, Barnes and Stockton tackle him, and while they're scuffling on the ground, Rothstein fires a bullet into the air. This is corroborated by the signs of struggle that were seen on the dirt road that day, as well as locals who said they heard a gunshot before the heist took place. Stockton and Barnes latch the bomb collar onto Brian's chest, and then Marjorie puts the t-shirt over him that says, "Guess." While she's doing that, she tells Brian that if the police ask who did it, just to tell them that it was 3 black guys. This explains why Brian, before his death, said that it was 3 black men he couldn't identify. Over the course of the robbery, Marjorie and Ken drove around to the locations that Marjorie had told the feds that she was at during the robbery, and the two of them watched with binoculars as Brian went through the steps of the heist itself. Whenever everything went wrong and the bomb exploded, Marjorie decided to get out of there, which resulted in her taking the wrong turn into the wrong direction of the highway and driving down the shoulder as the witness saw. On March the 27th of 2007, Stockton also made a confession in exchange for immunity, and his story corroborated Barnes. Now, at the time, it was not customary to record confessions. The thought process being that if someone is confessing in front of a camera, they're going to speak differently. So at the time, the FBI would just record notes and keep them internally. But according to the FBI, the two reports matched each other. Again, check out the Netflix documentary, because in the Netflix documentary, he calls Barnes directly, and Barnes gives him a recounting of that confession. Again, this entire video is basically just an advertisement for Netflix, so you're welcome. Here's a free one, I guess. Now, neither Stockton nor Barnes knew exactly who came up with this whole thing. They both kind of presented the idea that they were more so hired into the scheme. Although, since all this went down, the police have all but confirmed that the person who at least built the collar was Rothstein. After sifting through all of the junk in Rothstein's house, they found diagrams that were a one-to-one match for the explosive collar itself, as well as writing that matched between the two, and even what appears to be a small glimpse of Rothstein's handwriting on the back of one of the notes. So, at least the physical aspects, it seems Rothstein was the mastermind of. However, even if he did the physical building, which, again, we figured considering that he worked with metal and was a sort of craftsman, that's not to say Marjorie wasn't still the mastermind. Marjorie continues to say that she had nothing to do with it, but knows everyone else is involved, but at this point, it's their word against hers. So, Marjorie finally goes to trial for the conspiracy of bank robbery and use of a destructive device and blah blah blah, and she is eventually convicted on all 3 counts. During the trial, she was very annoying and loud and constantly yelled things like liar, and then the judge had to keep shushing her. And by the end of it, she was sentenced to life plus 30 years. Specifically, the charges that she was convicted of was armed bank robbery, conspiracy to commit armed bank robbery, and using a destructive device in a crime of violence. So, she gets sentenced to life and then some.
Why am I
Barnes got
stuttering
his
so
sentence
much? Holy
from
shit.
45 years for being responsible for the conspiracy down to 22 as part of his plea deal to testify against Marjorie. And Stockton just walked as a free man because he had already served his time for the 14-year-old girl
Rapid
thing that I mentioned earlier, and he
rounds.
somehow managed to get immunity
Definitely going
for
for
talking about all this.
that.
Also, during the trial,
What the
Marjorie was
fuck kind
diagnosed
of
with
build
breast
is
cancer
this?
and
This
was
shit
given
looks
7 to
ass.
10 years to live. Up to the end,
Does
Marjorie
not look
continued to
good.
say over and over again that she was not responsible for the conspiracy, that they got the wrong person, that the FBI's idiots for letting everyone else get away, and that Brian Wells was a part of the conspiracy. She maintained this up until her death on April the 4th of 2017. While he was scheduled to be released in 2027, Ken Barnes died on June the 20th of 2019 due to complications related to being diabetic. Floyd was never in court to testify against Marjorie because during the time of the trial, he was actually undergoing heart surgery. Again, he was free to go after the trial anyway because of the immunity deal he cut. And Stockton died last year on August the 10th of 2022 due to an acute respiratory failure. So now, every single person on this board is dead. And it seems that whatever this story was, whatever everyone's true account in the conspiracy might have been, it's dead with them. But there's one person up here who's still alive and still has a story to tell. And that's Jessica Hoopsick. See, the only way I've mentioned her in any of this so far is that she was a phone number written down in Brian's house after his death. During this entire
Oh my god, I
series of
sold
events for
that shit,
15
bro.
years,
Fuck.
the
What was I
FBI,
thinking?
local police, family members were all trying to get a hold of Jessica, but she always seemed to be
Motherfucker,
just
bro.
out of reach. Police would approach her, ask if she knew anything about the Wells case. She'd say that she didn't, and they didn't have, anything to arrest her with, so they just have to let her walk. News crews, the guy who made the Netflix documentary, the feds, all tried to get in contact with her, and she was always just out of reach. She came around whenever they did the initial trial and hearing regarding the case of Brian Wells itself because she was summoned, but after she gave a short testimony of not really knowing anything, she just walked out and never followed up with anyone. As a matter of fact, again, I know I keep mentioning the Evil Genius documentary, but in that documentary, the creator of it goes up to her and asks to do an interview, and she agrees to meet him later that day and then never shows up. See, the reason the police wanted her so bad, otherwise she would just be a number that Brian had. And again, he had a couple of prostitutes' numbers as well. There seemingly shouldn't be a reason that they're after Jessica so much if that was just one contact that Brian knew. But the reason that the police wanted her so bad is because she was mentioned by Ken Barnes. See, as mentioned earlier, Ken was a drug dealer, and specifically, he sold crack to a lot of the people around Erie. One of those people was Jessica Hoopsick. So, we finally have a tangible connection of all of this web of people that goes back to Brian. See, in spite of seemingly all this being cleared up, we had accounts from 2 different guys who were involved, and it seems pretty definitive that Marjorie and Bill were the main masterminds, or at least ones who did the physical labor of the heist. A lot of the little details don't make a lot of sense. Like, for example, he says that the day
Bullet
of
Life
August the
Steal
28th,
definitely.
whenever they call Brian,
I need
he
that. I
comes
need to
out
heal.
to the radio tower to deliver the pizzas to get set up for this heist, and then a fight breaks out when he realizes the bomb is real, right? Well, in his story, he says that Brian drives up to the radio tower, gets out of the car, and then waits for them to hand him the money for the pizzas. Which, what? Supposedly, according to Barnes, Brian is walking up to have, he's about to start a bank heist, and the phone call was just a ruse to get him out of work. So he's now standing there in front of him, and it also looks good like they kidnapped the random pizza driver, right? So he walks up to them, and he's like, okay, give me the money for the pizza
Man,
so I
W.
can take it
Victor,
back to my
holy
boss,
shit.
and then I'll come back and we'll rob a bank for $250,000. And the documentary maker confronts Barnes about this, and he's like, wait, you, why would he be waiting for the money? You all are about to rob a bank. And Barnes says, oh, well, actually, Wells didn't know that we were about to rob the bank. And the documentary maker's like, what are you talking about? You said he was at the meeting the day before. And Barnes is like, oh, well, yeah, he was at the meeting. He just, he didn't know we were doing it
I
then.
feel like that's
So
gonna be pretty
according to
good.
Barnes, Brian was there the day before at the pre-planned meeting. And then the next day when he shows up to the abandoned radio tower to go through with it, he doesn't know they're doing the robbery. Also, Barnes mentioned that Robert Panetti was at the meeting the day before as well. Yeah, remember that guy? And apparently, again, not public, but apparently Stockton corroborated this as well. But then he just disappears from the record. They don't say that he's at the radio tower. They don't say he's a part of a conspiracy. They just say he was at the pre-plan, supposedly to make sure that, I don't know, Brian is able to take that call, I guess, to drive out to the radio tower, and then he overdoses a few days later. What I think was happening is that they were, and again, I'm just a YouTuber, I am effectively a stupid child who is just saying his opinion as someone who reads cases like this a lot, so take it with a grain of salt. But in my opinion, it sounds like these guys were crafting the narrative that the FBI wanted to hear. They had their boards, they were asking questions about Panetti. They had suspicions that Wells was somehow involved because he knew the prostitute that bought crack off of Ken Barnes. So the FBI keeps pushing. It's like, oh, was Panetti involved? What about Wells? Was that guy involved? So they're just like, yeah, Panetti was there, and Wells too. But Panetti didn't show up again. We didn't see him till, we heard about him after he died. And Wells, he was there too, but he didn't know we were doing the robbery the day after we had the meeting for the robbery. So it seems like they're just crafting a narrative that fits what the FBI thinks is the story of what happened, because then they're able to get stuff like half of their sentence and full immunity in order to deliver these stories. I also think it's super suspicious that the guy who, again, had relations with a 14-year-old girl, such a heinous crime that if he did anything after that, he would be put under the jail, got full immunity in a murder bank robbery heist to give specifically information that was never made public, but corroborated with what Barnes says. That just feels a little bit weird. So there's some inconsistencies in their confession, and yeah, they're right about the parts about Rothstein and Marjorie, sure. But when it comes to stuff like Brian and Panetti, like, what are they talking about? Well, again, whenever the creators of Evil Genius were doing the documentary, Hoopsick went to prison on, again, an unrelated drug charge at the same time that Marjorie was still alive and in prison as well. While in there was apparently a fight between Marjorie and Jessica, where Marjorie said some heinous things to Jessica and apparently backed her up against the wall, maybe hit her a few times. So after Jessica gets out of jail, she called the documentary makers who she had previously stood up and said she's ready to tell her side of the story.
Oh, he
so
almost
after
got me.
about
He almost
15
got
years
me.
of silence, Jessica gives her side of the story.
He almost
She
got
says
me.
that
No.
one day she was
No.
buying crack from Ken Barnes when Ken Barnes mentioned to her that he's planning a bank robbery.
I do not
Again,
like this
back on
build
my
at
suspicions
all.
that Barnes and Stockton were more involved than they made themselves out to be. They just wanted themselves to sound good to the FBI. She says that Barnes was planning a bank robbery and asked Jessica if she knew somebody who would be a good gopher for the robbery they were about to commit. Effectively, they needed someone who would follow orders and they could scare into getting what they want. A couple things to note here. At this point, according to Jessica, her and Brian were not just on a business relationship, but they had seen each other enough times that they had a weird sort of friendship dynamic. They would go out to eat on occasion. Brian would drive her to her doctor's appointments. The other detail, and I do not mean this to be mean. This is going to sound mean. I know people are going to be like, oh, you shouldn't say that, but it is important to this case, and I think it's what a lot of people are implying, but no one will say specifically, so I'm going to be the one to get in trouble. Who cares? Brian Wells, from everything I've read from all the accounts around him, seems like a dumb guy. And I mean that in the nicest way. Everyone who spoke to him said he was such a kind, loving soul who was a joy to be around, but some of the nuances I hear imply that I'm not saying that he was mentally deficient. I think he was all there, but that he just simply wasn't the brightest. He dropped or failed out of high school, depending on which entry you read. He went to be a mechanic and then quit that and became a pizza delivery driver. And he had done that for the past 10 years and only showed up late to work on one day, and it was the day his cat died. He was a hard, diligent worker, and it seemed to be kind to those around him. His landlord said that anytime he would get happy, he would do a dance. Like, anytime he had an emotion, he was just bursting at the seams with it. And once again, I'm not saying that to say he was mentally deficient or there was anything wrong with him in any sense. I'm just saying he seems like the kind of guy who you could easily scare and get to do what you want. And it seems that Jessica thought that way too, because Ken Barnes said, if you can find someone for this heist, I'll give you crack for it. And she said that a client she regularly sees, Brian Wells, would be the right guy for the job. Jessica said that Bryant was a pushover. And after giving his information to Barnes, Barnes had Jessica get Brian's work schedule
fucking bad.
so that they would know the times he's delivering pizzas, and they'll plan the heist for a day that he'll be delivering. So despite years, over a decade, of the family and prosecutors believing that Brian and Robert were a part of this scheme, if Jessica's to be believed, it seems like both of them were innocent. And again, this isn't a perfect outcome to everything, right? Why would Jessica, who, mind you, is the person who gave Brian over to Barnes and this whole heist. According to her, she had no idea that they were going to kill the guy. She just thought it was part of a robbery, which I'm willing to believe. But she's still admitting to dragging an innocent man into this whole web of crime. And as the feds have pointed out, why be silent for 15 years and just come out with a story now, when she's in, theoretically, just as much danger if this is considered a murder? She's in just as much danger as getting charged with something now as she would have back then. And keep in mind, at this point, the FBI had closed the file. They said all these people were involved and that Brian Wells was a co-conspirator. And at the hearing for it, the family shouted and screamed that that was a lie, that Brian would have nothing to do with this, and Jessica stayed silent through all of that. So it's understandable to not believe her now when she comes forward after getting into a fight with Marjorie and saying that Brian was innocent. But at the same time, I don't know what she herself would have to gain from saying that now, because she was effectively cleared of any relation to it, or at least they couldn't get her on anything. And at the time she was in jail with Marjorie, it was just for an unrelated drug charge. So now she's out in the world, she can just walk away from it, but decides to go to the film crew and let them know that Brian was innocent. The documentary also brought up another interesting point. Perhaps the reason that Stockton, Barnes, and Marjorie, even though Marjorie never admitted to being a part of the scheme, she said she thinks Brian's involved, which, okay. But perhaps one of the reasons they all perpetuated the idea that Brian was involved is because, again, as the documentary points out, if Brian is a part of the scheme and dies when the bomb goes off, then that is almost kind of self-inflicted. It's like they were all conspiring for this crime and effectively an accident happened and he died. But if he's an innocent pizza delivery driver who they kidnapped, then it's murder. Then there's no statute of limitations on it. Then no one's getting a plea deal. So it was in their best interest to implicate Brian. And again, I'm pretty sure Robert was just because the feds kept asking about him. So they said, yeah, sure, he was at the meeting. But from everything I've seen, every source I've read, Robert had nothing to do with it. He was just a guy who had a drug problem, and during the stress of this whole thing, overdosed. So while, again, there's no definitive answer, it's pretty much who you want to believe out of this den of thieves, I personally don't think Brian was involved. While I was reading through all these case files and these court reports and what have you, before I ever got to Jessica's part,
that was fucking gay.
It was really cool researching this because it's like, you know, I was experiencing the revelations as they were happening. But before I ever got to Jessica,
I thought I was
the
doing
whole Brian
something.
thing didn't sit right with me. I know the FBI announced that they've officially concluded that he's involved, but they also officially concluded that Waco was justified. So, you know, I got problems with those little press conferences they do. But whenever I was reading all of this, and like
high
they just
velocity
kept saying
routes.
like Brian was involved, Brian was a part of the conspiracy, and he was up until
Get
because
that.
he thought it was going to be a fake
upgraded
bomb.
to
Then oh no, the bomb's
opening
real,
rounds, 100%.
and then he got scared. But then other people were saying he thought the bomb was fake the whole time until it started beeping on the
Opening
street.
rounds is
And
pretty broken
there
right
was
now.
no consistency, especially with
I
stuff
love my
like
broken
Barnes saying he was
characters.
waiting to take the money for the pizza. It just felt like it was an easier case if
Grab.
Brian is part of the problem, if he's part of it, because he did stuff like lie to the police about there being 3 black guys who threw it on him. He was knowingly embedded with a prostitute who knew Ken Barnes. Like, it just seemed easier if Wells was a part of it. No one goes to jail for murder. And I'm not directly saying this to imply that the feds made stuff up or whatever. I'm not saying that. But it just feels like after a series of cases that went on for over a decade, that they just like, okay, this is an answer, this closes it up. Well, by the time the FBI made their announcement, it had been 3 or 4 years, I think, but the trials continued over years and years. I don't know, it never set right with me. And then to hear Jessica,
Oh my god, I need to move faster.
that she was the one
Faster.
who gave
No,
Brian's
they left
information
blue. They
to
left
Barnes
blue.
to kick this whole thing off. That it's hard to explain. It's just like you look at all the pieces laid out, you look at the puzzle as it's built, you look at 15 different interpretations from different articles and journalists of what it all means, and Brian being set up is, to me, the only way all the pieces fit together. So again, just a dumb kid on the internet, but I do think that Brian Wells was innocent, and I think it is horrifically tragic that a guy can go in to just start delivering pizzas one day, and within an hour, his life is over.
I also want to clarify that Brian's involvement may not be as clear-cut as
No
it's kind of been
fucking
making
way,
out to
dude.
be. As I said earlier, he was a guy that could be manipulated. So maybe they
Oh my God, I
approached him
sold.
and threatened him or his family if he didn't comply with the plans they had moving forward. I mean, that would certainly explain things like Marjorie saying they measured his neck for the collar. Some reports say that Brian owed money to Ken, so maybe Ken threatened Brian and said if he didn't go through with this heist, something bad would happen. Another element of the story I forgot to mention in my initial recording is that shortly after Brian's death, Jessica had a child who she believes is the son of Brian. Perhaps she told Brian about this. Perhaps Brian thought something bad would happen to Jessica or his soon-to-be-born child. We don't know exactly what happened, but regardless if Brian was a part of this plan from the beginning or the day it happened, I still feel like Brian was a victim.
So, it seems like at the end of this, Marjorie was the mastermind of it all. She got Rothstein to do the manual work, and then all these 2 guys, Stockton and Barnes, were co-conspirators who did whatever level of legwork, and the victim was Brian Wells, coincidentally, because of the stress of it, Robert Panetti, and Jessica seemed to be the link between Barnes and Wells. And I got to that point, and I was like, yeah, I'm satisfied with
Look at the
this.
next wave coming up. We should be good
but there
after
was
that.
one question that kept bothering me through it all. So if this whole crew staged this robbery, which was not only, the biggest crime to ever hit Erie, Pennsylvania, one of the most insane and biggest crimes to hit the United States. Like, in 2003, this was the case everyone was talking about. So there's this massive case that has all these moving parts, angles, and questions. And why, if that's the case, then why would Bill Rothstein call the police over James Roden's body that was lying in his freezer? Because, again, his story is that, Marjorie killed Roden, and then I couldn't say no to her, so I stuffed the body in the freezer. Which is all well and good, but now we know that they had just committed a huge heist together, right? So why 3 weeks after that heist would you call the police on a body that you helped hide a month and a half ago with your co-conspirator? And here's my conspiracy theory. Here's how I think it played out. I really got the idea from this when I was reading the notes from Jim Fisher. He was an FBI agent who worked this case. Wired did an article where they recorded a lot of his thoughts. That Wired article is pretty good. I'll drop it in the description. But it was Fisher's idea regarding the case that made me look at this differently. So, off of his word, and again, I'm not smart, I'm just reading what smart people wrote down. My idea is effectively this. Marjorie, as it seems, orchestrated the whole thing. Her father agrees.
Go.
She wanted to kill him to take the money that he was giving away to people, and was seemingly going to do that through Ken Barnes. And I also don't believe anything that Barnes said that he was not going to kill her father, because you don't plan a heist for over a month over a murder you're not going to do. So Marjorie and Barnes begin to plan the heist. They drag in Rothstein and Stockton.
No fucking way.
Because Rothstein was old lovers with Marjorie and would do whatever she said. He was also good with mechanics and building.
Oh my god.
things.
Oh my god.
And
What the
Stockton
fuck
was
just
there
happened?
And also a criminal. And if you're sheltering a fugitive from the law,
No way I'm that bad. What happened?
You know, Pirates Code, they have to help you with future crimes. So the four of them plan out this heist, and it seems to me like Rothstein came up with a lot of the inner workings of it. See, Marjorie just wanted $250,000. Her goal was not to do a heist, it was to kill her dad. So, which out of these four people would have a proclivity for wanting to make an overly complicated series of notes to give to both the bomb hostage, the bank teller, and the police, would set up a giant scavenger hunt that Wells would have to drive through, which, by the way, the FBI recreated that drive multiple times during the trial and determined that there was no way to survive it. Even if Brian floored it the whole way and got from one location to the other without missing a beat, there was not enough
what
time.
is
By the
this
time he
lag,
got
bro?
that road sign, he was just going to drive wherever it told him and then blow up. So who would set up such a cruel series of hoops to jump through only to eventually get killed with a bomb and a giant metal
Motherfucker,
device
bro.
that is, once again, needlessly complicated? You can just tape a bomb to a guy's chest. You don't need the giant handcuff thing. Which out of these people would do all of that to look smart? Probably the guy who does everything to look smart. The self-titled fractured intellectual. So, Marjorie wants the money. Rothstein takes over all of the inner workings of it, you know, decides like, okay, it's going to be a series of notes, we're going to kidnap a guy, makes a heist that is more complicated than it needs to be. So the heist is carried out. Again, my belief is Barnes talks to Hoopsick. Hoopsick drags Brian into it by giving them his work schedule, making him be the pizza man that comes
Motherfucker,
out.
how do I miss that?
While they are putting the bomb on him, Marjorie says to say it was 3 black guys. And I believe that Brian, genuinely thinking if he does what the perpetrators said, that he'll be allowed to live or they'll let him go. I think the reason he said it was 3 black guys is because he was so afraid that if he disobeyed, he'd be killed, that he just said what they told him to say. Again, like Jessica said, he was a bit of a pushover. So after Brian dies, the police are looking everywhere. They have nowhere to start, to the degree that they are just looking for black men who are tangentially related to Brian Wells. So it seems like these 4, at least for now, are in the clear, and then Rothstein calls the police over Marjorie's dead boyfriend. I think what happened is Rothstein was a bit smarter than perhaps I initially, while reading this stuff, or a lot of the investigators gave him credit for. I think Rothstein knew that Marjorie had a big mouth, and 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. So he decides he is going to get out in front of this. And if anything happens, he is going to be the one who's buddy-buddy with the police, and more importantly, in front of whatever Marjorie says about him. So he calls the police over a murder that Marjorie had committed, and then, in such remorse over it, plans a suicide. If you'll remember, he wrote out that suicide note. And then, we're getting real harebrained conspiracy here, but stick with me. I think that Rothstein was smart enough to know that if you put at the top of the note, this has nothing to do with Brian Wells, the first thing the police are going to do is look into Brian Wells. And there's also that bag of blood that was at his house from his supposed attempt. Now, once again, between us, if you have a blade and are determined to do that,
oh no,
hard, frankly. So the idea that he only did it a little bit,
I'm throwing so hard right now.
The blood and the razor in a bag for the police to find, to be like, oh yeah, I attempted, and there's the evidence of it. That seems really suspicious. I think Rothstein, after this heist went through, which again, I think Marjorie gave the inception of the idea, and Rothstein ran with it. I think that Rothstein staged
Did they get it?
everything
No, I think
afterwards
they
that would
got it,
eventually
but-
lead to exactly what happened. The FBI looked at how complicit he was with the James Roden investigation, and he had turned so much attention to Marjorie regarding Brian Wells that Marjorie was yelling on the news that Rothstein, Bill, he's the one who killed Brian Wells. Everything went according to plan, that the FBI told them to walk, told them to get out of here. So this guy both assisted with the hiding of the body of James Roden and everything involving Brian Wells and walked out scot-free. I think a lot of the things that were seen as a sign of distraught, like the note or some of the comments that he made about Marjorie being manipulative and evil, I think that it was Rothstein once again being a bit smarter than perhaps I gave him credit for. And the most frustrating part about it is he was the first one to die. Like, as soon as that was over, he gets released, and then a year later, he's dead in a hospital bed. And still there on his hospital bed saying, no, not involved. When we know he was involved to some degree, right? Like, he has to be from the records that were seen in his house. He at least built the bomb collar. So he was involved, but the idea that he was the mastermind who just got to pass it off and die free makes me want to break something. Jim Fisher said it best when he said, Rothstein had to be the mastermind, and the most frustrating thing is he died with all the secrets. So yeah, that is my take on the crime, that Marjorie began the idea, Rothstein took it and ran, and all of this resulted in a scenario where Brian Wells was the victim. And in the end, once it was all over, Rothstein pulled the rug on everyone and was the only one of this entire crew who died without a conviction. I mean, Floyd wasn't convicted for this case specifically, but he was convicted for cases before. So yeah, that was a really needlessly long explanation about the bomb collar bank heist. I really hope this was interesting at all. I absolutely think this case is wild, like reading and learning about it. I tried to emulate that. I hope it came off some, the idea of like, oh, well, the guy who had the bomb around his neck, he's guilty, but then it turns out he is not guilty, or maybe kind of, depending on who you believe. And Marjorie was the mastermind, only maybe not. Maybe Rothstein was, but he's dead, so we don't know. So back to Marjorie. It's a really wild and turbulent case to read about. I understand
the fuck,
why
bro?
I give the feds a lot of harshness for some stuff, and most of it's in jest, because I do understand why this would be incredibly frustrating to investigate. But I think it's very interesting. So hopefully you think it's interesting too. Again, I know I mentioned it 100 times, but it's because it wasn't only a documentary, it was in the field work. It was in the field work. Check out Evil Genius on Netflix. It's fantastic. There's also a ton of other, YouTube videos. Famously, BuzzFeed Unsolved, Shane and Ryan, my boys, not that I know them, I just like their channel. Shane and Ryan made a video about this on Unsolved, but when they made the video, it was before Jessica Hoopsick's confession, so that's another layer added to it. But yeah, check out that video too. I'll link stuff like that in the description. I'll throw some links in there.
A couple notes to end on. For one, thank you very much to Dwayne from church for giving me the shirt that I wore in this video. It is very comfortable, and I hope I did you proud by wearing it in the video about a crazy murder heist thing. And also, this is a very large case with a lot of moving parts, and I'm sure that even after a couple revisions, I got something wrong. So if I can think of anything that I said out of order, or anything about the timeline or events that I got wrong, look in the description after this video's up. Underneath the ad, I'll put a little addendum section for any corrections I can think of. So yeah, if you think I got something wrong or want to make sure all the info's right, just check the description. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this.
Yikes, bro.
I think it's such an interesting case. Again, one of the most wild things ever. And I've talked about before, but true crime is kind of flooded with like serial killers and I guess some cults from time to time. But like some of the stories around bank robberies and like drug lords are by far the most interesting in my opinion. Like, I'm not gonna, if someone wants to steal this idea, they can. But how about some train robberies, huh? Train robberies are cool. No one talks about those. I'm gonna talk about one of those soon. But yeah, I love stories like this. I think they're interesting. I think they're neat, and hopefully you think they're neat too. And yeah, I've spoken my piece about it. So hopefully you enjoyed.
thank you for watching. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. More videos coming out this month. Stay tuned for hopefully some cool announcements with some